It was October of 2013 when I decided to take some time off work. I was 33 back then, working as a mechanic at a small auto shop in Belfort, South Dakota. I'd been through a messy breakup earlier that summer, and everything in town just felt stale, like I was stuck on repeat. I needed space, a reset. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I just packed up my old Dodge Dakota, loaded my gear in the back, and drove west toward the Bighorn Mountains in Wyoming. I'd camped there before a few times with friends, but this trip was solo. I liked the silence, the work of setting up camp, building fires, cooking for myself. There was something about being out there where cell reception dropped to zero that helped me clear my head. I drove into the foothills late in the day, stopping in Grable for fuel and jerky. I had a paper map marked with a spot I'd picked out months earlier, a secluded stretch of forest with a small ravine and stream running through it. Not a real campsite.
No saini.
Just a patch of public land tucked deep off the forestry roads. I figured I'd have the place to myself for a week. Maybe hike, maybe hunt a little. By the time I reached the tree line, the sun was dropping fast. The road turned to gravel, then dirt, then rutted tire tracks through golden brush. I put the truck in 4WD and crawled slowly until I found the old clearing. It looked like no one had camped there in years. Dead branches scattered everywhere, pine needles thick on the ground, a fire pit sunken into the earth with blackened stones still in place. I shut off the engine. Everything went quiet except the ticking of the cooling engine and a breeze whispering through tall spruce. I set up my tent near a large boulder about 10 feet from the drop-off into the ravine. The stream below it was low, more of a trickle, but it still had that clean, cold smell that reminded me of glacier melt. I gathered dry wood, stacked it into a teepee, and lit my first fire just as twilight settled in. I remember sitting there, my boots off, watching the flames sway in the wind. No cell signal, no headlights in the distance, no sounds but the fire and the forest. I thought I'd sleep well that first night, but I kept waking up. It wasn't noise that woke me. It was more like a feeling, not fear, not at first, just a kind of prickling, like when you know someone's staring at you. I remember looking out through the tent mesh at the moonlight casting shadows on the trees. Everything looked normal. I told myself I was just unsettled being out there alone. My brain playing tricks. It happens. But the next morning, I found something odd. At first, I thought it was my own footprints. Maybe I'd gotten up and walked around in the night. But I checked my boots and they were clean, dry. These prints were damp and sunken in mud by the stream. Bare feet, long toes, too long, way too narrow. I told myself it could have been a bear or a big cat, though deep down I knew better. I grew up out here. I know the tracks of every animal in this part of the country. These weren't like any I'd ever seen. I didn't leave. I should have, but I didn't. I told myself if someone was out here, maybe a hunter or a drifter, I'd hear them. I'd see them. It's not easy to move through this terrain without snapping branches or crunching undergrowth. That second day, I went for a hike along the stream, heading west into a narrow gorge with high granite walls. It was beautiful but steep and isolated. No sign of animals, no birds even, just wind and water. That emptiness should have been calming. It wasn't. That night, I made a bigger fire. I stacked more wood, kept it going late. I kept my boots inside the tent. I laid my hunting knife next to my sleeping bag. Sometime around 3 a.m., I heard movement, not just branches swaying. Something stepped near my tent. It wasn't a deer. The steps were too deliberate, slow, one at a time. Crunch, pause, crunch, pause, like it was waiting between each one. My heart was pounding, but I didn't move. I listened, every muscle frozen. Then I heard breathing, shallow, ragged, not like a wild animal, not like a man either, just outside the tent wall. I waited, held my breath. After a minute, I heard it move again. This time, away from the tent, toward the ravine. Then silence. At dawn, I got out and looked around. No prints this time. Nothing disturbed. But I saw something far worse. My firewood pile was torn apart, like something had dug through it with hands. Not paws. I found long gouge marks in the bark of the nearby trees, 4 or 5 feet off the ground. Not claw marks, like something scraping fingers against them. Still, I didn't leave. That's the part one can't explain. I think I was too curious, too stubborn. I didn't want to be the guy who panicked over a few footprints and scratches. On the third day, I hiked north, away from the gorge, up a steep ridge. I wanted a better view. From the top, I could see miles of forest. No signs of people.
No smoke. No camps.
I sat up there for a while, eating jerky and watching birds circle in the wind. But when I came back, I found something that turned my stomach. My tent flap was open, not unzipped, just hanging like someone had pulled the zipper down and left it. Nothing stolen, nothing moved, but I know I zipped it shut. I always zip it shut. I searched the ground again. Still no prints, but now I felt watched. The whole time I built my fire, I felt eyes on me. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I kept the fire burning until the sun came up. I made coffee at dawn, trying to calm my nerves. I told myself I'd pack up after breakfast. But then I heard something, movement down in the ravine. Not footsteps, scratching, like nails on stone. I stood at the edge and looked down. I saw nothing, but I heard something breathing. And then, just before I turned away, I saw it. Something stood half in shadow behind a boulder. Thin, pale, hairless, like a person but wrong. Too tall, shoulders slouched forward.
Elbows bent backward.
It moved and I saw its face. Or rather, I didn't. It had no expression. Just skin stretched too tight. No eyes that I could see. Just 2 deep holes where the eyes should be. It ducked away fast, almost like it hadn't meant to be seen. It didn't run. It just slid back behind the rocks without a sound. I dropped my cup, took off running. I packed in under 15 minutes. Didn't even fold the tent. I threw everything into the truck bed and floored it. My wheels spun in mud before they caught. I tore down that dirt trail, bouncing in and out of ruts, scraping tree branches until I hit gravel and then asphalt. I drove straight to Sheridan, found the cheapest motel I could, and locked myself inside. I stayed there for 2 nights. Didn't sleep the first one. Barely slept the second. I kept thinking I'd see it again, outside the window or in the parking lot, but it never came. When I finally got back home, I told a friend about it. Well, part of it. I said I saw a mountain lion. He nodded like he believed me. Maybe he did. I didn't tell him about the footprints, or the tent, or the face. Couldn't. Even now, years later, I don't know what I saw. I've read about things. Skinwalkers, shapeshifters. I don't know if I believe in any of that. I don't even know if what I saw was real. But I haven't camped alone since. I still have the tent. It's in a storage bin in my garage. Sometimes I think about throwing it away, but I don't. It's like a reminder of something I can't explain, something that changed the way I see the woods. I still go hiking, still go hunting, but only on public land. Day trips, always with friends, and never near that ravine. My name is Will Carter. This happened in the summer of 2014, when I was 33 years old. I'd been living in northern Georgia for most of my life, working odd jobs and doing seasonal outdoor work, trail maintenance, brush clearing, forest restoration projects. I'd also gotten into the habit of taking solo camping trips whenever I had a few days free. I liked quiet places. I liked being far from people. I didn't realize how badly that could turn against me until the night I camped in a forgotten graveyard off a dirt road near the base of Pine Hollow Ridge. I'd found the place by accident. I was driving a rough back road trying to find a creek that cut through a valley I'd never explored before. I had no real destination, just a printed map and the kind of rough directions old locals scribble down at gas stations. After an hour of dead ends and overgrown paths, I came around a sharp bend and saw a rusted metal gate tucked in behind a row of crooked pine trees. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The gate was chained but not locked. There was no sign, no marker, no clear path leading in. It took me a while to realize it was a graveyard. The headstones were buried deep in weeds and fallen branches, most of them leaning or broken. Many so worn down I couldn't even read the names. The whole area was maybe half the size of a football field, completely fenced in with sagging metal posts and sagging mesh. In the middle of it all stood a thick-limbed oak tree with rotted rope nailed to its lower branches. Someone had once tried to hang a tire swing there, probably decades ago. I should have walked away right then, but I'd been driving most of the day, and I hadn't seen another person or car for at least 3 hours. The sun was dropping fast, and the idea of setting up camp somewhere private, somewhere no one would bother me, seemed like the perfect end to the day. I walked the area for about 10 minutes, checked the ground for holes or animal dens, and then set up my small one-person tent close to the fence under the tree line, not far from the gate. There were no fresh graves, no signs of anyone visiting. Whoever had been buried here had been forgotten a long time ago. The ground was uneven, sunken in spots, but dry. I set up my stove, cooked some canned chili, and ate while watching the sky turn orange through the tree canopy. It was quiet except for the wind. The first thing that felt off was how quickly the temperature dropped. It wasn't cold, maybe 65 degrees, but it fell fast once the sun went down. I'd camped plenty of times in the mountains and knew how fast it could change, but this felt different. It was the kind of sudden drop you feel when walking into a shaded ravine after being in the sun all day. It wasn't dangerous, but it was sharp, like walking into a cooler. I zipped up my jacket, cleaned up my meal, and climbed into my tent. I fell asleep sometime around 10. What woke me wasn't a noise. It was the silence. I know that sounds stupid, but anyone who's camped deep in the woods knows that true silence doesn't exist. There's always something: crickets, frogs, wind moving leaves, branches creaking, something. But this was like someone had flipped a switch. No sound at all. No wind. Nothing. I opened my eyes. It was dark. Pitch black. My tent has mesh windows, and on a normal night, even a little moonlight helps shape the outside world. This time there was nothing. Just the feel of the nylon walls around me and my own breathing. I unzipped the door quietly, more out of habit than fear, and leaned out to look around. Still no sound. Still nothing but dark. I sat there for a few minutes trying to adjust my eyes. I could just make out the outline of the oak tree against the sky. A few clouds moved across what I assumed was the moon. The graveyard looked still, same as when I'd set up. Nothing had changed, but I couldn't shake the feeling something was wrong. There was no wind, but I heard something start to click. Faint, slow. It wasn't a clock or animal. It sounded like metal, but light, like tapping two coins together. I froze. Came again, a few seconds later. Still faint, but closer. Still no wind. Still nothing else moving. I strained my ears, turned my head slowly. The sound stopped, and then, just barely, I caught the sound of gravel shifting. I'd walked the graveyard enough earlier to know there were no gravel paths. The only gravel had been outside the gate on the road. That meant something or someone was on the road. My chest tightened. I shut the flap to the tent quietly, grabbed my flashlight, but didn't turn it on. My knife was still in my pack. I slid it out, opened the blade, and held it low by my side. I sat there for maybe 10 minutes. No more clicking, no more gravel, just silence again. Eventually, I convinced myself it was an animal. Maybe a deer on the road, or a raccoon nosing through the brush. I laid back down, still fully dressed, knife in my hand. I kept the flashlight by my pillow. I didn't fall asleep again. Just before dawn, I heard a soft thump. Not far, just outside the tent. I sat up instantly, heart slamming. I didn't move, didn't unzip the tent. The sun wasn't up yet, but the dark was starting to lift. I could just barely see through the mesh again. Nothing. I waited another few minutes before turning on the flashlight and unzipping the tent. There was something lying on the ground a few feet from the entrance. I stepped out slowly and knelt. It was a dead squirrel, fresh.
No rigor, no rot.
Its neck had been broken clean. I looked around the clearing. Still no sound, no movement. The gate was still shut. I buried the squirrel with a small stick and moved fast. I didn't even bother packing properly. Just shoved everything into the truck bed and got on the road as fast as I could. I drove to a gas station about 40 miles away, got coffee, used the bathroom, and stood in the lot for 20 minutes trying to decide if I was being paranoid. I drove back out there after lunch. I had to. When I got back to the site, the tent was gone. Everything was gone. The grass where I'd set up had been flattened. The fire ring I'd made was still there, but my tent, my pack, my stove, even my folding chair, gone. I'd taken my sleeping bag and clothes with me in the truck, but everything else had vanished. There were no tire marks, no footprints, no drag marks. Nothing. But the thing that rattled me most was the rope in the oak tree. It wasn't the swing I'd seen the day before. That rope had been old, frayed, covered in moss. This one was new, freshly cut, tied into a noose. I stared at it for a long time. No one else was around. No sound but the wind. I didn't tell anyone. Not the gas station guy, not the cops, no one. I just drove home and never went back. That graveyard isn't on any map I can find. I tried for weeks after that, looked through county records, asked people I knew who'd lived in the area forever. No one knew what I was talking about. I drove those roads again and couldn't find it. It was like it had been erased. I don't know what I walked into that night, but I haven't camped alone since. And if I ever do again, it won't be anywhere near forgotten places, no matter how quiet they look. I don't usually take solo trips, not the kind that put me far from a main road anyway. But in the fall of 2017, I needed a reset. I had gone through a breakup that left me numb, not angry or sad, just quiet. My job at a tire warehouse in Reading was steady but mindless, and I'd gotten used to the sound of forklifts more than the sound of my own voice. I had 4 days off saved and a used 2008 Toyota Tacoma that had only let me down once. I threw my tent, some freeze-dried food, a gallon jug of water, and a cheap camping stove in the bed, topped off the gas tank, and pointed north into southern Oregon. The plan was simple: find a quiet trail, park far out, hike deep, and sit with my thoughts. The second day out, I found myself on a back road off Highway 138, somewhere between Roseburg and Crater Lake. It wasn't listed on any camping app one had, but that was part of the draw. It looked like an old fire service road, narrowed by years of disuse. The forest around it was dense, old-growth Douglas fir and hemlock, and the underbrush was mostly sword ferns and vine maples already turning red and gold for fall. About 5 miles in, the road split into 2 rutted paths. One went uphill toward a ridgeline, the other down toward a wide creek I could hear before I saw. I went downhill. The path was rocky, and even with 4-wheel drive, the Tacoma bucked and dipped like a boat. I finally found a clearing just off the creek where someone had clearly camped before. There was a circle of blackened rocks for a fire ring, and even a rotting picnic bench someone must have dragged up years ago. I parked beside it and got out. No sounds except the slow hush of water and wind in the trees. It felt untouched, good kind of quiet. I set up my small tent on a flat spot above the creek. No cell service, which was expected. I ate a packet of instant rice and chicken on the tailgate and drank warm water straight from the jug. When the sun went down, I sat with my back against the picnic bench and stared into the fire until it burned low. The dark out there wasn't like city dark or even backyard dark. It was thick total. I woke up around 3 a.m. that first night, needing to piss. The air outside was cold and sharp. As I stepped away from the tent, I noticed something strange. My fire pit, which I'd let die out completely, had a small curl of smoke rising from it. I crouched beside it and touched the rocks. Cold. Maybe a leftover ember reignited from a breeze, I thought. I stirred the ashes just to be sure, then went back inside. I told myself not to be paranoid. The next day, I hiked upstream with my day pack, trying to trace the source. It wasn't a big creek, but it had carved a narrow gorge through moss-covered rocks. I climbed over fallen logs and knelt to study animal tracks near the bank. Deer mostly, some raccoon. I saw no sign of people. After maybe an hour of steady walking, I noticed the trees started thinning, and the sound of running water was joined by something else. A metallic clink, like a hammer hitting steel in the distance. I stopped, turned off my headlamp, and listened. Stopped too. I waited. Nothing. Another 30 minutes in, I found a rusted-out pickup deep in the trees, maybe 40 yards off trail. It was a late 70s Ford, red paint turned orange with rust. Tires shredded. Doors open. Inside were old beer cans and a jacket across the bench seat. Untouched. No plates on it. That gave me pause. It didn't look like it had been in a wreck or dumped from the road above. Someone had driven it there and left it. Long ago, but still. I turned back. The second night was different. The air was heavier, clouds moving in. Around 10 p.m., I noticed a light in the trees across the creek. Not bright, just a dull orange glow, like someone had lit a lantern. I stood still and watched. The glow flickered but didn't move. I didn't want to assume the worst. Could be another camper. Could be someone hunting. Still, it bothered me that there was no sound, no voices, no movement of any kind. I put out my fire completely and sat inside my tent with my headlamp off. At some point, I dozed off. I woke up again around 2:45 a.m. and immediately knew something was wrong. It was dead silent, no wind, no creek. Like the whole forest was holding its breath. I unzipped the tent slowly and looked out. The light across the creek was gone, but something was near. I couldn't explain it. I could just feel it. I didn't hear footsteps, but the undercurrent of wrong was strong enough to make me grab the hatchet. I kept next to my sleeping bag and sit with my back against the side of the tent, staring at the zippered door. Sometime before dawn, I fell asleep like that. I planned to leave the next day, but curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to know what that light had been. So after coffee and a cold granola bar, I crossed the creek barefoot and started walking in the direction I'd seen the glow. About half a mile in, I found signs of something recent. A trampled patch of ferns, boot prints, not hiking boots but work boots, wide tread. I followed them. They led to a small flat spot where the ground had been disturbed. Not dug deep, just churned. Someone had kicked dirt and leaves around to cover something. I squatted down and brushed it away with a stick. Underneath was a square of canvas tarp. I pulled it up and underneath were bones. Not fresh, but not ancient either. Long bones like femurs or arms. Maybe a deer, I told myself. But then I saw a boot print right in the middle of the tarp, as if someone had stepped on it to hide it better. The print was recent, edges still sharp. That's when I started to hear movement behind me. Branches creaking softly, then a short exhale, not mine. I turned, fast. Nothing there. I backed away slowly, heart pounding. The forest felt different now, too alive, too focused, like it had eyes. I crossed the creek fast and packed up camp in under 10 minutes. The road out was worse than I remembered. Wet leaves had turned slick, and the truck slid a few times even in 4-low. When I hit the main road again, I didn't stop until I saw a gas station on the outskirts of Roseburg. I parked, went inside, and sat with a coffee at a plastic booth until the cashier asked if I was okay. I nodded, just tired. 2 days later, I called the non-emergency sheriff's line in Douglas County and told them about the tarp and the bones. I didn't give my full name, just said I'd been camping near the trail off Highway 138. The woman on the phone thanked me, said they'd look into it. I never heard anything back. I've camped since then, but never alone. I'll drive an hour out of my way just to find a marked campground now, and I make sure I have signal or a sat phone. I tell myself what I found was an old hunting cache or some idiot trying to bury a dead deer. But that doesn't explain the light, the fire pit that smoked on its own, or the sharp print on the tarp. Something was out there, and I left just in time. It was late September of 2019 when I finally decided to return to the woods. My husband Matthew had passed away the winter before. It had been 9 months. 9 long, cold months where the house felt too empty, too wide, even though it was small. I didn't go back to work. I barely left the house. But grief changes form with time. It doesn't go away, but it shifts like fog lifting just enough to let a little light through. One evening, while sorting old camping gear in the garage, I found our map of Quiet Pines, the forested area we used to go to every fall. The last time we went, it was 2017. The campground was basic, just a long dirt access road, a few fire pits, and an old water pump. No ranger station, no paved trails, no cell service. It had always been a place we could go and get away from everything. No one else seemed to know about it.
No crowds, no noise.
Just pine trees and wind. I packed up the old gear by myself. The same tent we used, though I checked the seams and zippers twice. I brought the same blue sleeping bag, the old kettle for boiling water, the battered backpack we always shared. The boots were still dirty from our last hike together. I kept them that way. I left early on a Friday morning. The drive from the house in Columbia Falls to the edge of Quiet Pines took 3.5 hours. I stopped once for gas, filled a thermos with coffee, and took the rest of the ride in silence. No music, just the sound of tires on gravel once I turned off the main road. There was no sign for Quiet Pines. You had to look for the turnoff. A dented mailbox half buried in grass and dirt, then a narrow path that disappeared into the trees. I parked near the same clearing Matthew and I always used, about a quarter-mile walk from the access road. I left the car in gear with the wheels turned slightly uphill and shouldered my pack. The air smelled like pine and dry leaves. The wind rattled the canopy high above, but the forest floor was quiet. My boots crunched softly on the trail, and I could hear my own breathing. I reached the clearing after 10 minutes. It looked the same. That surprised me more than I thought it would. The same big rock near the center, the same fallen log where we used to sit and make coffee in the morning. I stood there for a while just looking around. No one else was out here. I hadn't seen any cars or hikers on the way in. I set up the tent close to the tree line. It was just big enough for 2. But this time it was only for me. I staked it down tightly and unrolled the sleeping bag inside. The air was cold already, and the sun was starting to dip low, casting orange light through the trees. I made a small fire using the twigs and logs left behind in the pit. They were dry. Someone must have used the spot earlier that summer. Dinner was just instant noodles and a handful of trail mix. I sat on the log with my knees tucked in, watching the flames. The woods got quiet fast. That kind of silence where every little rustle sounds big. I didn't hear any owls. just wind in the branches and the snap of firewood. I went to bed early. It was pitch black inside the tent, even with my flashlight on low. The sleeping bag smelled faintly of Matthew, of the old laundry soap he used. I wrapped the zipper up to my chin and closed my eyes, trying not to think about how empty it felt. Sometime around 2 a.m., I woke up. No sound woke me. It was just that sharp, uneasy kind of waking where your mind jolts into alertness for no reason. My heart was beating fast. The wind had stopped.
No rustling, no creaking.
Just silence. I stayed still, listening. Then I heard it. A single, slow footstep just outside the tent. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a branch falling. It was deliberate, heavy, the sound of a soul pressing into the cold ground. I froze. My fingers clutched the edge of the sleeping bag. I waited. Nothing. For what felt like minutes, the forest stayed quiet. Then another step. Closer. I reached slowly for the flashlight and clicked it on. The inside of the tent glowed soft yellow. I didn't unzip the flap. I didn't move, just kept listening. My breathing sounded too loud. Then silence again. Total. A deeper silence than before, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. By morning, nothing seemed out of place. I stepped out of the tent and looked around.
No footprints.
No broken twigs. I told myself it was probably a deer, or maybe the wind had shifted something nearby. I forced myself to believe it. I boiled water for coffee and sat on the log, watching the sunlight filter through the trees. My hands shook slightly as I held the cup. The second day was uneventful. I went for a short hike around the clearing, following the trail Matthew and I always used. There were no signs of anyone else. No trash, no gear, no fresh boot prints. I tried to enjoy the stillness. I sat by a stream for a while and watched a squirrel pick through leaves. By late afternoon, I felt a little better, more settled. I had convinced myself I was just spooked by the silence. But when I returned to camp, something was wrong. My sleeping bag had been unzipped. I hadn't left it that way. I was sure of it. I always zipped it fully before leaving to keep out bugs. I checked again. The zipper was halfway down. The bag was still in place, but the flap had been pulled back slightly, like someone had looked inside. I stood there for a long time, staring at it. My first thought was a person. But how would they find me? And why not take anything? My gear was untouched. My backpack, my phone, even my keys, they were all where I left them. I didn't sleep that night either. I kept the flashlight in my hand, laying stiff in the bag with the zipper pulled up tight. I listened for every sound, but heard nothing. No steps, no breathing, no wind. In the morning, I found something new. Near the edge of the clearing, about 20 feet from the tent, there was a rock sitting on top of a tree stump. A perfectly round, gray stone I hadn't seen before. Too clean to have just rolled there. It was placed. Deliberately, I picked it up. Cold. Smooth. Not from around this part of the forest. Something in me shifted. I packed everything in a hurry. I didn't even eat breakfast. I threw the tent poles in loosely and jammed my sleeping bag into the pack. The fire pit was cold. I hadn't used it since the first night. I doused it with the last of my water anyway. I started back toward the car. Halfway there, I smelled something strange, like rot. Not strong, but just enough to catch. I stopped, looked around. The trees were dense. The light was dim, even in the morning. I listened again. Still nothing. When I reached the car, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was a handprint on the rear window, smudged, wide, with streaks down the glass like fingers had dragged. It wasn't mine. I hadn't touched the back window. I'd loaded the gear through the trunk. The print was large, the fingers long. I stood still for a full minute, staring at it. Then I opened the door and got in, locked everything, started the engine. I drove fast, bouncing over the rough road until I hit pavement. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station an hour away. I sat in the lot for a while, trying to slow my breathing. I didn't call the police. What would I say? No one had attacked me. Nothing was stolen. But I knew what I felt out there. I knew what I saw. I never went back to Quiet Pines. That winter, I sold the tent, the stove, the sleeping bags. I kept the boots. I still wear them sometimes when I walk the trails near my house. Local ones, day hikes, places with people nearby. It's been a few years now. Every once in a while, I think about that second night, about the zipper pulled halfway, the handprint, the smooth stone. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't weather. Someone was out there, watching. I used to believe we were alone in places like that nature was quiet and safe if you respected it. But I don't think that anymore. I don't camp overnight now. I still go on hikes, but I'm always back before dark. I carry a whistle and a knife. I let people know where I'm going. I pay attention to every sound, every print, every change in the air. Losing Matthew was the worst thing that ever happened to me. But that trip showed me something else, something that lives in the woods that we don't talk about because it doesn't wear a name. It's not a ghost or a monster. It's just a person, maybe several, people who wait, people who watch, and they don't need a reason. They just do. It was in the early fall of 2013 when I decided to go camping alone in a part of northern Oregon I hadn't been to before. I was 32 at the time, working a desk job in Portland that had been grinding me down day by day. I was tired of screens, people, the same commutes, and the same damn sandwich shop down the road. So when I found out I had 3 days of leave approved, I packed up the gear I kept in the back of my closet. An old 2-person tent, a propane stove, a sleeping bag I hadn't used in a year, and set out toward a place marked on an old hiking forum. It was called Crooked Pines Trail. The directions were vague, but that was part of the appeal. I had to turn off the main highway after about 2 hours of driving, then take a gravel road that wound up into the foothills, thick with lodgepole pines and underbrush. There was no signage past the first half mile. I used the printout from the forum post as my guide. The rain started not long after I passed a broken fence that marked the entrance to the trailhead. Light at first, just a mist really, but I could see it darkening the edges of the pine needles and tapping softly on my windshield. There was no one else there. The only sound when I got out of the car was the wind and the faint patter of rain on leaves. The place felt abandoned, but not in a creepy way at first. More like nature had reclaimed it. I parked under a stand of trees, loaded my backpack, and slung it over my shoulders. I also strapped my small hatchet to the side. I didn't expect to need it, but old habits stuck from years of camping as a teen with my uncle in eastern Washington. The first 2 hours of hiking were uneventful. The trail was narrow but not overgrown, with tree roots and rocks poking through the mud. It wound slowly uphill through dense forest. The smell of wet moss and pine was strong. I passed a few rusted trail markers, mostly unreadable. By the time I reached the flat ridge I'd aimed for, the sky had darkened to a dull gray. The rain picked up, not a storm, just steady, soaking rain. I pitched the tent beneath a partial canopy of branches and set up camp fast. I got a small fire going with dry shavings from my pack and used my rain poncho to shield it long enough to cook some beans and rice. It wasn't great, but it was warm. As night came on, I stayed close to the fire. I didn't have cell service, and I hadn't expected to. That was the point. I had my small notebook and a flashlight. I jotted a few things down, mostly how quiet it was. Not just peaceful quiet, but a sort of hollow silence. No birds, no distant frogs, not even the occasional crack of branches from animals. That should have struck me more than it did, but I was focused on the heat of the fire and the ache in my back from the hike. Around 10 p.m., I zipped into the tent and lay back on my sleeping bag. The rain hadn't let up, and now it was tapping harder against the nylon. I listened to it for a while, letting my mind drift until I slipped into a shallow sleep. It didn't last long. Somewhere in the early morning hours, maybe around 2 or 3, I woke up sharply.
No noise.
Just a feeling, that kind of sudden wakefulness that feels like someone nudged you. I didn't move at first, just listened. The rain had eased slightly, though still coming down. But I realized what was strange. There was a new sound, faint, rhythmic crunching, like something stepping on wet gravel or soft twigs. Not fast, just slow and deliberate. One step, pause, another step, then quiet, then again. I lay still, holding my breath. I thought maybe it was a deer or a black bear moving near camp, but I didn't hear snorting or sniffing, just the steps. They moved closer, then stopped. I couldn't see anything out the front mesh. The tent flap was closed, and my flashlight was near my feet. I slid my hand slowly down the bag, gripped the flashlight, and flicked it on. I didn't unzip the flap. I just held it, not sure what I would even do with it. The steps had stopped by then. I lay like that for a long time, light off again, heart thudding. Eventually, I drifted back into a thin sleep, but it was restless. I dreamed of branches snapping, of water dripping endlessly, of movement in the shadows. When I woke again, it was light, gray, but clearly morning. Rain still fell, but not as heavily. I stepped outside and looked around. No signs of animals, no prints I could see. Just the same wet forest and low clouds. I told myself it had been a raccoon or some small animal curious about the camp. I shook off the nerves, packed up my cooking gear, and hiked farther along the trail, planning to do a loop that would bring me back down to the car by the next evening. About 4 miles in, I reached an old clearing, grass-choked and ringed with fallen logs. I stopped to rest. I noticed something off to the left, beyond a break in the trees. I walked toward it, pushing branches aside. There, nestled between mossy stones and leaning trees, was the crumbled shell of a cabin. More like a shack really, weathered boards, half the roof caved in, and a rotting front door hanging by one hinge. It didn't look like it had been lived in for decades. Still, curiosity got the better of me. I stepped inside. The floor was soft with rot. The air smelled like mildew and something else, old animal droppings maybe. There were a few broken chairs, an iron stove rusted through, and what looked like a cot frame. The place gave me a bad feeling. Not fear exactly, just wrongness. I backed out and didn't linger. That night, I set up camp farther down the trail, near a narrow stream. The rain started up again. I kept the fire small and tucked the tent closer to a rock overhang for shelter. I ate, wrote a few lines in the notebook, and tried not to think about the shack. I was asleep not long after sunset. I woke up again in the dark. This time I knew something was different. There was no rain, just the sound of water trickling nearby, and footsteps again, closer and slower. I didn't move. I held the flashlight but didn't turn it on. I heard a single twig snap, not like a squirrel or small animal. Something heavier, then breathing, close. I unzipped the tent flap just enough to peek out. Nothing. I waited. 10 minutes, 20. Then something brushed the side of the tent. Not hard, just the lightest stroke, like fingers. I scrambled out, flashlight in hand, and swept it across the trees. Nothing. I shouted once, a short loud sound just to break the silence. Then I stood and waited. Still nothing. I didn't sleep again that night. First light, I packed everything. I skipped breakfast, rolled the wet tent as fast as I could, and hiked back to the car. But here's the thing. When I got there, after nearly 8 hours of walking through the wet woods, I saw something that made me freeze. There were prints in the mud near the car. Not mine, bare feet, adult-sized, dozens of them, around the vehicle, toward the trees, back again. Not deep enough to say when they'd been made, but fresh enough. The weirdest part was how erratic they were. Some short steps, some longer, like someone limping or crawling at times. I stood there a long time, just staring. I checked the car. Nothing broken, nothing taken. I unlocked it, threw my gear inside, and drove. I didn't stop until I reached the next town. Burns, I think it was, and got a motel room for the night. I checked the windows twice before going to bed. For months afterward, I tried to reason it out. Maybe someone lived out there off-grid. Maybe they followed me out of curiosity. Maybe they saw me as a trespasser. Maybe it was just coincidence, an unrelated hermit crossing paths with a dumb camper. But then something else happened. 3 weeks later, a news article showed up online. A hiker went missing not far from Crooked Pines. Guy in his 40s, solo backpacker. They found his car, packed the same way I'd packed mine. His tent was found about a mile off the main loop, torn apart by what they said were animals. No other remains. No foul play suspected. I saved the article. Still have it. I haven't been camping since. It was late September 2016 when I decided to take a solo camping trip in the south of France. I was 34 at the time, and after a stressful few months working in logistics back home in Leeds, I needed something different. I had been to France before, but never alone, and never to this part of the country. A friend of mine had once mentioned the Ardèche region. Its limestone cliffs, thick forests, and winding rivers. I looked it up one night and saw pictures of calm waters, rugged terrain, and scattered, quiet campgrounds tucked into nature. It seemed perfect. I booked a ferry crossing from Dover to Calais, then drove down in my old gray Renault Megane, packed with a two-man tent, a camping stove, food, and a few essentials. The drive took about 10 hours in total, split over 2 days. I stayed at a cheap roadside hotel the first night in Macon, then reached the village of Valenpont-d'Arc by the afternoon of the next day. It was small, peaceful, and surrounded by natural beauty. The town had a couple of bakeries, a butcher, a pharmacy, and a few bars, most of which were already closing early for the season. I had picked a camping spot based on a random blog I found, run by a retired Dutch couple who had spent the last 5 years traveling Europe. They'd written about a semi-wild campsite along the Chassezac River, not far from the main tourist path, but far enough that it wasn't on Google Maps. The directions were vague. Turn left after the bridge with blue railings, drive down a gravel path for about 15 minutes, look for a large fallen tree, but I managed to find it. There was no sign, no marked plots, just an open forest clearing by the river. No other cars were there. Felt remote in a good way. I set up my tent in the flattest part of the clearing, close enough to the river that I could hear the water flowing, but far enough that I wouldn't risk any flooding if it rained. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. The river was slow and dark in color, its surface broken occasionally by rising fish or floating debris. I unpacked my things and made a quick meal on the stove. Pasta with tuna and tomato sauce from a can, then sat by the water as the sun dipped behind the trees. There were no lights around. Once it was dark, it was pitch black. I could see the stars more clearly than I had in years. The silence was total except for the river. That first night I slept well. A little cold, but nothing out of the ordinary. The next morning, I woke to a layer of mist hanging over the ground. I made coffee on the stove, then hiked for a while along the river's edge. The forest was thick in some areas, with brambles and nettles growing wild, but there were game trails and old footpaths, most likely used by hunters or fishermen. I didn't see a single person the entire day. I found a small rocky beach upstream and spent an hour sitting there, just watching the water. That evening, I went to bed early. It was fully dark by 8 p.m. I had brought a book with me, but I barely read it. I remember thinking how peaceful the place was. No other tents, no traffic noise, no distant dogs barking. Just the wind, some rustling leaves, the river, and the occasional insect buzzing near the tent. But around 2 a.m., I woke up, not because of a sound. At first, I wasn't sure what had stirred me. It was one of those moments where you open your eyes and something just feels off. I lay still and listened. The river sounded the same. There were no voices, no footsteps, no rustling, nothing, just silence. But it wasn't the same silence as before. It felt heavier, like the air itself had changed. I reached for my headlamp and switched it on, the beam cutting through the inside of the tent. Everything was where I had left it. My backpack, the book, the shoes by the flap. I stayed like that for maybe 5 or 10 minutes, then switched the lamp off and tried to sleep again. Just as I was drifting off, I heard a noise outside. It was soft, like something brushing against the tent. At first, I thought it might be a branch shifting in the wind, but there was no wind. I held my breath. Then I heard it again, on the other side this time, like fabric being touched lightly, maybe by fingers or claws. It wasn't strong, not a full-on grab or anything, just the faintest of touches. I sat up and turned on the lamp again. I didn't move or make a sound, just stared at the nylon walls of the tent. The sound stopped. After a while, I convinced myself it had been a mouse, or maybe a hedgehog, something small moving around. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there, right next to me. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I walked around the site. I didn't see any animal tracks or signs that anything had been near the tent. The ground was hard and dry.
No prints, no droppings.
I made breakfast, cleaned up, then went for another hike. This time I went further upstream, deeper into the forest. I found a small, abandoned stone structure, maybe an old shepherd's hut or tool shed, almost hidden under ivy. The door had collapsed inward. Inside was nothing but broken wood and some animal droppings. By the time I got back to camp, it was late afternoon. I had that same sense of unease. Not full-on fear, not yet, just a weird awareness of being alone. It's hard to explain unless you've felt it. The realization that you are completely cut off.
No reception.
No other campers. No one knew exactly where I was. I made dinner, read for a bit, then lay in the tent with the lamp off. At around 1:30 a.m., I heard the noise again. This time it was louder. It was a scrape, like something being dragged across the dirt and stones. I sat up immediately. My heart was pounding. The sound stopped the moment I moved. I held my breath and listened. Then, a new sound. Breathing. It was just outside. Not fast, not panting. Slow, calm breathing. The kind of breathing someone does when they're standing still. I froze. Every hair on my body stood up. I didn't know what to do. I was unarmed, unless you counted a folding knife buried in my bag. My mind raced. Was it an animal? Person? I waited. The breathing stopped. I heard soft footsteps, maybe 2 or 3, then silence. I didn't sleep at all that night. When the sun finally came up, I got out of the tent and looked around. Again, nothing. No tracks, no items moved, no signs anyone had been there. But I couldn't deny what I'd heard. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't sleep deprived. I decided I would leave that day. I packed slowly, checking everything twice. Then I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Just at the edge of the clearing, where the trees began again, there was a small circle of stones on the ground. I hadn't made it. I was certain it hadn't been there before. It wasn't big, maybe 2 feet across, but the stones were carefully arranged, evenly spaced. In the center was a single pine cone, upright. It looked deliberate. I didn't touch it. I didn't go near it. I finished packing, loaded the car, and started the engine. The gravel path back to the main road felt longer than it had coming in. Every turn made me nervous. I kept checking the rearview mirror. I finally reached the bridge and the paved road beyond it. I didn't stop until I was back in Valenpont d'Arc. I checked into a small guest house that night. The owner barely spoke English, and I was too shaken to try my bad French. I slept with the shutters closed and a chair pushed under the doorknob. The next morning, I went to the tourist office and asked if that area by the Chassazac was a known campground. The woman there looked confused. I showed her the rough spot on a printed map. She shook her head. "Pas camping la," she said. "No camping there." I asked if there were any houses nearby, maybe hunting cabins or small farms. She said, "Non.
Forêt.
Just forest." I thanked her and left. I spent the rest of the week in more normal places. Actual campgrounds with other people around. Noise, cars, families. I didn't go back to that river. When I got home, I told a few people about it, but not the full story. Most people thought it was an animal. A badger, maybe, or a fox. But foxes don't breathe like that, and they don't leave circles of stones. Years later, I came across a forum thread about off-grid camping in France. One person mentioned that in some rural areas, old traditions still linger, rituals, warnings left in the woods. Circles of stones meant something. They were used to mark private land or hunting zones, or sometimes just to warn people off. Maybe that's what it was. A warning. Whatever it meant, I've never camped alone since. And I never will again. I was 31 when it happened. It was October 2013, just outside a small town in southern Montana called Hardin. I'd been working construction jobs since I dropped out of college. Never really settled anywhere, just saved up when I could and kept moving. That year, work had dried up early, so I figured I'd take some time to drive through the West before heading back toward Idaho where my sister lived. I had this old green Tacoma, a single cab, bit of rust on the rear fenders, and a topper I'd bolted on myself. Nothing fancy, but enough to keep the rain off me. I had an old sleeping bag and a foam mattress in the back, along with a couple storage bins with gear. Tent, stove, a couple cans of beans, flashlight, extra water, bear spray. I didn't like to camp at organized spots. I preferred the quiet. Usually found some dirt road, drove down a ways, parked off into a clearing or near a creek. That day, I'd driven for hours through open country. I wasn't using my phone much, no service for long stretches, and I liked just following my gut. Somewhere past Crow Agency, I saw a gravel road split off toward the east. No signs or anything, just a narrow track with potholes and weeds poking through. I pulled over and checked my map, an old paper one I kept in the glove box. Looked like the road curved back into some hills about 10 miles in. There was a mark for an abandoned quarry, circled faintly in red. That's all I needed to see. It was late afternoon by the time I got up there. The road ended in a wide open pit, maybe a quarter-mile across. Looked like they used to cut sandstone out of it. Gray, flat walls, piles of broken rock at the edges, and a sharp drop where heavy machines had cut a bowl into the earth. Trees had started growing in the cracks, and some brush filled in the low spots. There was a gravel rise to one side that made a sort of flat overlook. I parked up there. No tire tracks, no sign of anyone. Just wind and sky. I set up my stove and heated a can of soup. The air was dry and cold, the kind that makes your nose sting when you breathe. I wrapped myself in my jacket and leaned back against the tailgate, just staring out over the pit as the light went gold, then purple, then dark. Coyotes howled a few times, but they were far off. I crawled into the bed of the truck around 9. Didn't bother with the tent. It was too cold and windy for bugs, and I liked having the truck walls around me. I slid the topper shut and locked it, then laid out on my side. the foam pad soft enough to ease the hard floor. I left one window cracked for air. Outside, the wind moved through the brush in long, low waves. I don't know what woke me. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't even fear, not at first. It was just that feeling something wasn't right. I blinked a few times, trying to adjust to the dark. My watch said 2:43 a.m. The moon was bright, lighting the quarry in pale blue. I was about to roll over and go back to sleep when I heard something soft, a kind of crunch, like a shoe on gravel. I lay still, holding my breath. Another crunch, a little closer. Coyotes don't walk like that. Deer don't either. This was slow, careful, heavy. I reached for the can of bear spray near my head, my fingers wrapping around the cold metal. I didn't hear anything for a minute. Then again, crunch. It sounded like it was coming from the edge of the rise, maybe 20 feet from my truck. I didn't move. My heartbeat was in my throat now, tight and hard. I was trying to think. Did I see another vehicle? A fire? A flashlight? No, nothing. I'd been alone. Then came the sound that still sticks with me, a dry dragging noise, like something being pulled slowly across the gravel. Not a branch or a stick. Heavier. Maybe a boot or a rope. Another crunch. I stayed frozen. My eyes were locked on the corner of the topper's window, just a crack of moonlight showing part of the pit. I couldn't see anything. The sound stopped. Then I heard a thud. It was quiet, not loud, but close, like someone had dropped something soft but heavy, like a bag of sand or a dead animal. No more footsteps. I waited. 10 minutes, maybe 20. I don't know. My body was stiff with cold and fear. I finally dared to move, slow and quiet, and peeked out the window. Nothing. Just the moon on the rocks, the empty quarry below. Still, I didn't sleep again. At first light, I stepped out and looked around. My boots crunched on the frost-covered gravel. The truck was untouched. I walked to the edge of the rise, where I thought I'd heard the sound. That's when I saw it. Footprints. 2 sets. One light, almost barefoot looking. The other boots. Wide treads. They'd come from the tree line, circled the rise, stopped about 15 feet from my truck, then back again. I followed them as far as I dared. The boot prints turned and disappeared into the trees. But the barefoot ones, they didn't go back. I scanned the area for signs of an animal, a person, anything. Nothing. Just more gravel, low brush, and frost. But then I saw the drag marks, a set of scuffed lines in the gravel, winding down the slope into the pit. I didn't follow them. I just stood there, staring. I packed up as fast as I could. Drove out without breakfast. Didn't stop until I hit the interstate. A week later, after I'd made it back to Idaho, I looked up that quarry. It hadn't been used since the 80s. No public access. I found one article, some kid had gone missing near there in 2004. Never found. Another guy went hiking in that area in 2009. His body turned up 30 miles away, barefoot and half-clothed, cause of death unknown. Local sheriff said maybe hypothermia. I didn't report anything. What could I say? I didn't see a face, didn't get a plate number, just noises, prints, and that dragging sound in the dark. But something happened up there. I wasn't alone that night. I haven't camped alone since. I still hike, still go out into the woods now and then, but never without someone else. And never in a place where I can't see the road. There's something out there. Not ghosts, not monsters, just people. The kind that watch and wait. The kind that know you're alone. The kind that move when it's quiet. And the worst part is you'll never hear them coming until it's too late. That's what I believe now. And that's why I never go back to Montana. I went camping alone in France back in the summer of 2018. I was 29 at the time, living in London, and needed a break from work and everything else. Things had been feeling heavy for a while. Too many screens, too much noise, too many people. I'd grown up in the countryside in the UK and missed that kind of silence you can only get when you're truly away from it all. So I booked 2 weeks off, packed up my gear, and drove down through the Channel Tunnel into northern France, aiming to spend my time in different parts of the countryside. By the 4th day, I'd made it south of Dijon, somewhere near a small village called Morvan. It wasn't a touristy area, and the rolling hills and thick green forest surrounding it looked like the kind of place I'd hoped to find. I'd read about the Parc Naturel Regional du Morvan online. Thousands of square kilometers of woodland, hills, streams, and old trails. It was quiet, and even in the middle of summer, I didn't see many cars around. I'd found a small pull-off along a rural road that opened into a lightly wooded area. There were no signs saying I couldn't camp, and no fences, so I parked my hatchback just off the road and started hiking in with my gear. I didn't go too far, maybe half a kilometer in, just far enough that I couldn't hear the occasional passing car. I wanted to feel like I was in the middle of nowhere, but I also didn't want to risk getting completely lost. The ground was soft from the previous week's rain, and the trees were tall and thick, with moss climbing up their trunks. I found a small flat clearing with a mix of pine and oak trees surrounding it and set up my tent. Felt peaceful. The sky was open above the trees, and I could see patches of blue through the canopy. It smelled of damp earth, pine needles, and something slightly sweet from the wildflowers nearby. I made myself a small campfire with stones and deadwood, boiled water for coffee on my little stove, and watched the sun dip lower through the trees. The first night was normal. Birds quieted down by sunset, and the woods got still. I heard the usual rustling now and then, probably squirrels or deer. I had a headlamp, but I mostly sat near the fire with my lantern lit low and read from a paperback. I felt a bit uneasy at first. Being alone in the dark woods tends to do that, but nothing happened. I went to bed early and fell asleep quickly. The second day, I hiked deeper into the forest, following a game trail. I didn't see anyone the whole time. I walked for hours, made some simple notes in a little sketchbook I carried, took a few photos, and came back to camp by late afternoon. I cooked, cleaned up, and turned in again early. Another uneventful night, but on the 3rd day, things shifted. Started with a feeling, nothing more. I woke up earlier than usual, around 5 in the morning, because of this strange sense of being watched. I know how that sounds, but that's honestly what it felt like. I opened the tent and stepped outside. The forest was still foggy in patches. Nothing looked out of place, but I had this tight feeling in my chest, like something was different. I shrugged it off. I made coffee and ate some trail mix, then spent most of the day sketching and reading. I stayed close to camp, maybe a little more on edge than usual, but I couldn't explain why. There were no signs of animals or people, but that feeling didn't go away. Around sunset, I noticed footprints near the edge of the clearing. At first, I thought they were mine, but I'd been careful with where I stepped, and these weren't mine. They were boot prints wider than mine and slightly deeper. Someone had walked through the area while I was gone that day, not close to my tent, but near enough to be unnerving. They came from the trees and went back the same way. I stared at them for a long time, trying to convince myself they might be old, maybe from another hiker. But the ground was soft. I'd seen no one. I didn't like it. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept the lantern on in the tent and listened. The forest makes all kinds of sounds. Branches creaking, wind moving through the leaves, animals foraging, but my ears were sharp. I kept thinking I heard footsteps, maybe just a couple at a time, then nothing, like someone was testing how quiet they could be. I left the tent at one point around midnight and stood in the clearing. Everything was dead quiet.
No breeze, no crickets.
No night birds, just stillness. I slowly turned around in a circle, shining my flashlight into the trees. half expecting to see someone standing there. But nothing, just trees. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. The next morning, I considered packing up and leaving, but I convinced myself I was overthinking. I told myself it was just paranoia, probably caused by being alone for too long. I stayed. That day, I barely left camp. I kept checking the area, looking for more footprints, for broken branches, for anything unusual. I found one thing. A piece of fabric stuck to a branch maybe 50 meters from my tent. It looked like part of a shirt sleeve, torn and faded, caught on the bark like someone had brushed past too fast. It didn't look old. The edges were frayed, but not weathered. That's when my stomach turned. I kept thinking about that print, the one near the camp, and realized the fabric lined up pretty closely with where the tracks had come from. Whoever it was, they were moving through here, maybe watching. I started thinking that maybe they'd found my camp already and just waited for me to leave each day. I skipped the fire that night. I cooked quietly, cleaned up everything, and didn't turn on the lantern. I wanted the dark. I wanted to hear everything. I laid in the tent for hours, not reading, not sleeping, just listening. I started counting the seconds between the forest sounds. Then the sounds stopped again. It was close to 2 a.m. when I heard it. Not an animal, not the forest, but the sound of someone stepping on dead leaves. Slow, deliberate. I held my breath. Then I heard it again, closer. Just 1 or 2 steps. Then silence. I sat up slowly and reached for the flashlight. I unzipped the tent just a little and peeked out. It was pitch black outside. I didn't turn on the light yet. I wanted to use my ears. Another step, then 2 more. They were just outside the clearing now. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to walk naturally. They were being careful. Then nothing for maybe 10 minutes. And then suddenly a long scraping sound. I didn't know what it was at first. It sounded like something metal dragging across bark, like a knife or a blade against a tree. That sound cut straight through me. I couldn't move. I just sat there, gripping the flashlight. After that, everything went quiet again. I waited until sunrise before I dared to leave the tent. When I stepped outside, I scanned the whole clearing, and that's when I saw it. A tree about 20 feet from my tent had a long, diagonal slash cut into the bark. Fresh. The inner wood was still wet. It had been made with something sharp. It hadn't been there the night before. That was it. I packed everything up in 30 minutes, barely even 8. I felt like I was being watched the whole time, like eyes were on my back with every movement I made. I kept scanning the woods, waiting to see a shape between the trees, but nothing showed. I made it back to the car and got the hell out of there. I didn't stop driving until I reached a town called Auten, where I found a small roadside hotel. I checked in, locked the door, and didn't sleep. That might have been the end of it, just a terrifying encounter in the woods. But 2 days later, after I'd calmed down a bit, I saw something that locked it all in. I went into a local police station in Auten, not to report anything. I had no real evidence, no crime had occurred, but just to ask if there had been any incidents in the forest. I told them where I had camped and asked if they'd had trouble there before. The guy at the desk nodded and pulled a folder from a drawer. He didn't show me the whole thing, but he did tell me that there had been a few disappearances in the Morven area over the past decade. Mostly hikers, solo campers, people traveling off the grid. Nothing ever confirmed. No bodies found. But the locals, he said, avoided camping alone deep in those woods. When I asked why, he said simply, "Some places aren't watched." That was it for me. I drove straight home the next day. I still think about it. I think about that sound, the footsteps, the blade dragging, the prints. I think about how quiet it all was, how whoever was out there didn't want to be found, didn't want to talk. I wonder what they would have done if I hadn't woken up, if I hadn't listened. I wonder how long they watched me before I noticed. If they watched me read, eat, sleep. I'll never know who that man was. I never saw him, just the signs, just the presence. but that was enough. I haven't gone camping alone since. It was October 2021 when I took a solo trip out to northern Arizona to get away for a while. I had just turned 34, and I felt burnt out from work, my phone, everything. I wasn't going through anything dramatic. I just needed a break from people. I'd grown up around forests and deserts and had done plenty of solo trips in the past. This wasn't new to me. I wasn't trying to find myself or test anything. I just wanted silence. I wanted to go to sleep to the sound of wind and wake up to the sight of juniper and red sand. Nothing more. I picked a spot near Kaibab National Forest. Not too deep into it, but far enough that I wouldn't be near traffic or other campers. The road in was a mix of dirt and rock, about an hour off the main highway, and pretty rough. I had an old 2008 Tacoma that could handle it. I brought my gear, food for a week, extra water, and a journal. My phone barely had reception, and that was perfect for me. The area I camped in was flat, dusty, and wide open except for a few clusters of pine and juniper. There were no official campgrounds, which was what I wanted. I set up my tent next to a large boulder that faced away from the direction I came in, just in case someone stumbled across the area. I didn't want to be seen. From the spot I picked, I had a 360 view of the scrubland. Nothing but dry yellow grass and scattered trees stretching for miles. The days were warm, but not hot. The nights dropped quickly into the 40s. Cold enough to need layers, but not enough to make me miserable. The first 3 days were calm and quiet. I hiked a little, made some basic meals, read a few chapters from a book, and wrote in my notebook. I kept to a simple routine. Wake up with the light, make coffee, walk around the area, eat, maybe nap in the shade, then make something for dinner before sundown. I kept a small fire going at night, but I didn't need it much. I was more focused on staying low profile. The only sound out there was the wind and the occasional hawk. At night, there were coyotes yipping in the distance. Normal desert noise. The second night, I thought I heard something walking around near the trees, but it could have been anything. Rabbits, deer, whatever. It didn't sound big, and I didn't see anything when I stepped out with my flashlight. Just the beam of my light bouncing off brush and silence. It was on the fourth night that things changed. I had gone to sleep like normal, layers on, sleeping bag zipped, headlamp next to me in the tent pocket. I always keep my boots inside the tent to avoid any critters getting inside them. At some point during the night, I woke up suddenly. Not from a sound exactly, but from something feeling off. The kind of feeling you get when you think someone's watching you, even if you're alone. I sat up slowly, staying still for a few seconds to listen. The wind had stopped completely. No rustling of grass or trees.
No coyote yips.
Nothing. It was dead quiet. That kind of silence isn't natural in the desert. Even at night, there's usually some kind of movement. A bug, a distant call, something. But this was like the air had thickened. I unzipped the sleeping bag just enough to reach for the headlamp. I didn't turn it on yet. I listened harder. Then I heard something. Soft, dry footsteps. Like someone walking barefoot over the dirt and loose pine needles. It was slow, almost careful, and coming from the direction of the trees about 30 yards away. I turned on the light. The beam wasn't strong, but it was enough to catch movement. For half a second, I thought I saw a figure, low to the ground and moving in a crouch behind a bush. It didn't look like an animal. The movement was all wrong. It wasn't on four legs, but it wasn't walking upright either. Just low, slow, and wrong. I stayed still. I didn't call out or move. I waited and watched. Nothing came out. Eventually, I turned the light off and sat in the dark for maybe 20 minutes. The footsteps didn't return, and I didn't hear anything else. I convinced myself it was just a trick of the light, Or maybe my brain misfired. I'd been alone for days after all. I slept a little more after that, but not well. When I got up in the morning, I went over to the bush where I thought I saw the figure. The dirt around it had been disturbed. Not footprints exactly, but the ground looked scuffed, like something had crawled or slid through. No animal prints, just shallow drag marks in the dry earth. I walked a wider circle around the area. Nothing else out of place. No trash, no human prints, no signs of anything. I told myself again it was just my mind playing tricks. Maybe a mountain lion, maybe a raccoon, maybe I was overthinking it. The 5th day I stayed close to camp. I kept my knife on me, and I built up the fire ring with more rocks. I don't usually like keeping big fires, but I wanted something more visible that night. That night, I stayed up late. I didn't go into the tent until after midnight. The wind was back, and the normal desert noises had returned. I felt better. I slept for maybe an hour before I woke up again. This time, I knew I heard something. A rustle outside, like a person stepping through dry grass and stopping just short of the tent. I stayed absolutely still. I didn't grab the light. I just listened. More movement circling this time, maybe 10 feet out. I could hear the crunch of the ground under careful steps. Then silence again. I forced myself to unzip the tent door slowly. Just a crack. I peeked through. Nothing. But just as I started to close it, I caught movement at the edge of the firelight. A shape, not tall, maybe 5 feet.
No visible clothes.
Just the pale outline of a body standing completely still, half hidden behind a tree. It didn't move. It didn't flinch when the firelight flickered. I didn't move either. We stayed like that for maybe 30 seconds. Then it crouched fast. The shape dropped low and disappeared behind the brush. It didn't run. It slipped out of sight like it had melted into the ground. I shut the tent and sat up the rest of the night with the knife in my hand. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I packed up fast. I didn't eat, didn't boil water, didn't write in my notebook. I took down the tent in record time and threw everything into the back of the truck. But before I drove off, I walked over to where I saw the figure. There were more drag marks, shallow trails through the dirt that didn't look like boots or hooves or paws, just smears like elbows or knees. There were no prints around them.
No cigarette butts. No rapes.
Nothing to show a person had been there, but I knew what I saw. As I walked back toward the truck, I heard something behind me, a rustle, faint but close. I turned around fast and saw it again, clearer this time. It was a person, or something shaped like one. Pale, thin, crouched low to the ground with one hand pressed against the earth like it was about to sprint. Its face was turned toward me, but I couldn't see any eyes or mouth in the shadows. We locked there again, silent, unmoving. Then, with almost no sound, it backed up, still crouched until it disappeared behind the trees. I didn't wait around. I ran to the truck, slammed the door, and drove out, scraping the bottom of the truck more than once. I didn't care. I just wanted to be gone. It took almost 2 hours to reach the highway, and once I did, I drove straight to Flagstaff and got a room at the cheapest motel I could find. I stayed there for 2 days. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I didn't even open the tailgate. I just laid in the room, doors locked, trying to understand what I saw. I didn't go back to that spot. I never camped in that part of Arizona again. I still camp, but only in public campgrounds now, and always near other people. I bring more gear. I leave less trace. I sleep light. People have asked me since why I stopped doing solo desert trips, and I never give a real answer. I just say I got tired of the silence. But the truth is, I don't think I was alone out there. I think something was watching me from the first night. It didn't make noise at first. It didn't want to be seen, but it came closer, slowly, learning how I moved, how I slept, how long I'd be there. It wasn't a skinwalker. It wasn't anything from legends. It was real, flesh and blood, maybe a person, maybe someone twisted by time or solitude or something worse. But it was real, and I saw it, and it saw me. It was the fall of 2018 when I decided to take a short break from everything. I was 28 years old at the time, and things had been building up. Work stress, a recent breakup, and just a general sense of burnout from the usual routine. I wasn't much of a traveler or even a camper, to be honest, but I liked the idea of being alone somewhere quiet. I grew up around rural Michigan, and I knew a few hidden spots people didn't visit anymore, places off the map. One of those was an old graveyard deep in the woods near Perry Lake, which was about a 2-hour drive from where I was living in Flint. The cemetery had been abandoned for decades. No one maintained it anymore, and it was nearly invisible unless you already knew it was there. The entrance was just a rusty gate buried in brush off an old dirt logging road. The last time I'd been there was with my older cousin when I was around 12. It always stuck in my memory, not because it was spooky, but because of how silent it was. I remembered moss-covered headstones, sunken ground in weird patterns, and the way the trees formed a dense canopy overhead. The air was always still there. No traffic, no houses, no voices. Just the sound of leaves, the occasional bird, and whatever was crawling around in the brush. That weekend, I packed my truck with the basics. A tent, sleeping bag, headlamp, fire starter, water, a few sandwiches, and some basic tools. I brought my folding knife and an old hatchet I'd inherited from my grandfather. I didn't plan on staying more than one night, just enough to reset my mind. I left on a Saturday morning, took the back roads, and reached the turnoff by midday. The logging road was mostly overgrown but still passable. The tires crunched over broken branches, and the truck shook with every rut I hit. I parked a good distance from the graveyard, on a flat patch where I wouldn't get stuck if it rained. Then I grabbed my gear and walked the rest of the way in. I followed the barely visible path that curved through the trees and eventually saw the crooked iron gate, just like I remembered. It was even more rusted now, leaning heavily to one side. Vines had grown over most of it. Inside, the cemetery looked like nature had nearly taken it back. Headstones were cracked or fallen, many covered in moss or half buried in the ground. Some of the writing was illegible. Trees had grown up between the plots, and a few roots had even lifted entire gravestones out of place. I found a flat spot near the far end of the cemetery where the graves were more spread out. It was open enough to set up my small tent, but still surrounded by trees. I laid out a small tarp, pitched my tent, and gathered a pile of dry wood from around the area. I set up a small fire ring using old rocks I found nearby and started a fire just before the sun dipped below the trees. The orange glow flickered across the gravestones, casting long shadows that shifted with every breeze. As it got darker, the forest seemed to close in tighter. The air cooled quickly, and I could feel the dampness rising from the ground. I ate one of the sandwiches and drank some water while sitting on an old tree stump. The woods were quiet, too quiet, honestly. No distant traffic, no planes overhead, no animals calling to each other. It was the kind of quiet that pressed against your ears. That night, I stayed close to the fire, adding logs every half hour. I didn't bring a book or music. I wanted silence. I thought that would help me think. But my mind wouldn't settle. I kept glancing over my shoulder. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Not in a ghostly way, but more like someone else was watching me. I chalked it up to being tired and my mind playing tricks. I eventually crawled into my tent around midnight, leaving the fire to burn down to embers. I left my boots just outside the tent flap and kept the headlamp around my neck. The ground was uneven, and I could feel the contours of roots and stones through the sleeping pad. I kept tossing and turning, trying to find a comfortable spot. Every time I shut my eyes, I'd hear something. A twig snapping, leaves rustling. The kind of noises that are impossible to place. Animals, probably. Maybe a raccoon or deer. But then I heard what sounded like footsteps. Not animal movement, actual human footsteps. Slow, steady, careful steps that crunched the dead leaves one at a time. I froze. I didn't breathe. I turned off the headlamp and laid there in silence, trying to listen. The footsteps stopped just outside the tent. My heart pounded in my chest. I stayed still, not even daring to reach for my knife. I could hear breathing, very faint, but unmistakable. Someone was standing right there. Then, nothing. No footsteps moving away. No more breathing. Just dead silence again. I don't know how long I stayed frozen like that, maybe an hour. My legs went numb. I couldn't think straight. At some point, exhaustion overpowered fear, and I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, it was morning. Light was streaming through the tent fabric, and birds were chirping. I shot up and unzipped the tent. My boots were gone, just gone. I looked around in every direction, scanned the ground for footprints, anything. But there were no signs, just the cold ashes of the fire, some half-eaten food wrappers, and that uneasy silence still hanging in the air. I spent the next hour searching for the boots, convinced maybe an animal dragged them off. I checked the tree line, under bushes, even behind the old headstones. Nothing. I had to put on my backup pair of sandals I kept in the truck. I broke camp quickly and packed everything up in a hurry. I didn't want to spend another minute there. As I left, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had watched me the entire night and had done something just to mess with me. Something calculated, but quiet. I hiked back to the truck fast. The logging road was just as rough going out, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get back to the highway and leave the woods behind. When I finally got home that evening, I checked every inch of my gear. No damage, nothing missing except the boots. That should have been the end of it. But 2 weeks later, I got a letter in the mail. No return address, just my name handwritten. Inside was a photograph. It was me sleeping in the tent. The picture was taken from outside the tent, maybe 10 feet away with a flash. I recognized the sleeping bag, the headlamp around my neck, even the way I slept with one arm over my eyes. The photo had no writing on it, no message, nothing, just the image. I never went back to that graveyard again. I didn't tell anyone either, not for a long time. I still have the photo tucked away in a drawer. I thought about burning it, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I've camped since then, but only in regular spots with people nearby and cell service. I stopped chasing that perfect silence I thought I wanted. Because sometimes, when things get too quiet, it's not peace. It's a warning. And whoever was out there that night, they weren't a ghost. They were real, and they were close enough to watch me sleep, take my picture, and leave without a sound. I don't need to know who it was. I just know I'm never camping alone again. I went camping alone in New Mexico back in early October 2018. I was 33 at the time, and I had taken 2 weeks off from work to drive across the Southwest and spend time off-grid. I'd been living in Lubbock, Texas for a few years, working in maintenance for a school district. Most people I knew would have chosen to go to the beach or maybe fly somewhere. But for me, peace came from the open land, far away from roads and people. Camping out under the stars, hiking during the day, and just sitting by the fire at night gave me a calm I couldn't find anywhere else. I'd already hit up a few places across Arizona before I crossed over into New Mexico. A friend of mine had told me about a semi-remote spot near the Gila National Forest that wasn't too well known, somewhere around the northern edge of the forest, but away from the main trails. He'd camped there a few years ago and told me it was quiet, overlooked, and had great views. He dropped a pin on the map and texted it to me weeks earlier. I kept it saved for this trip. I drove up in my older F-150, packed with gear in the back and enough supplies to last a week if I rationed carefully. I had a large cooler packed with meat, bottled water, some pre-cooked pasta dishes in airtight containers, dry snacks, and a couple of six-packs of beer. I carried my .45 in the glove compartment and had a pump-action shotgun stowed under the back seat. Not because I expected trouble, but because being alone in the wild makes you cautious. People, not animals, were what made me nervous. Took me longer than I thought to reach the location. The dirt roads weren't marked well, and GPS got spotty the deeper I went. I passed an abandoned ranch building a couple miles before I reached the spot. Something that looked like it hadn't been lived in for decades. Old rusted-out trucks, a collapsed roof, and weather-beaten walls. I didn't think much of it at the time. I just figured it was one of those places that got swallowed up by time. When I reached the clearing my buddy had told me about, it didn't disappoint. The land opened up in a natural basin, surrounded by sparse pine trees and thick brush in some areas. There was a flat spot big enough for a tent, and a stream not far off. It looked perfect. I set up camp quickly, pitched the tent, stacked firewood, dug a small pit, and set up a cooking area using a fold-out table and small propane burner I brought with me. The first 2 days were quiet. I'd wake up around dawn, make instant coffee, hike for hours, come back, cook, sit by the fire, and just breathe. I didn't see a single person. No vehicles passed by, no planes overhead. The only sound came from the wind, birds, and occasional rustling of small animals in the brush. That's exactly what I wanted. But the third day, something changed. Started small, just little things I noticed that didn't seem right. That morning, I went on a long hike along a dry creek bed and came back around mid-afternoon. When I returned, I saw that one of my folding chairs was turned over. That didn't make sense. The wind wasn't strong enough to flip it, and it had been in a sheltered area near the tent. I didn't panic. I just figured maybe I hadn't set it right and brushed it off. That night, while I was eating by the fire, I kept feeling like something was off. The kind of feeling you get when someone's watching you, but there's no one there. I looked around a few times, but everything looked the same. Nothing moved in the brush, and I didn't hear anything strange. I sat there longer than usual and waited for the fire to burn lower before heading into the tent. I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up to sounds, soft cracking noises, like footsteps on dry twigs. But every time I sat up and listened hard, it stopped. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, I finally got up and unzipped the tent. The fire was still barely glowing, and the woods were dead silent. I stood out there for maybe 5 minutes, staring into the dark trees, feeling like something was out there but not being able to see it. I eventually got back into the tent, laid with my eyes open until I dozed off. The next morning, I found a set of boot prints about 15 yards from my tent. They weren't mine. I always wore heavy-soled hiking boots with a distinctive tread. These were different, lighter, narrower, maybe a size smaller than mine. They came from the tree line, circled near the tent and fire pit, then went back toward the brush again. I stood there staring at them for a long time, trying to piece it together. That meant someone had come through my camp while I slept. No animals walk like that. They weren't deer or mountain lion tracks. These were human. I went straight to the truck and checked inside. Everything was there: keys, weapons, gear. I scanned the area with my binoculars but didn't see anyone in any direction. Still, I felt uneasy. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I'd come out here to be away from people. One visit didn't mean I was being hunted or anything, right? Maybe it was just some local hunter passing through, curious about a campsite that wasn't usually there. That's what I told myself. That night, I stayed up late. I didn't drink, didn't listen to music, didn't do anything that might distract me. I kept the shotgun close. I had a small tactical flashlight with a high lumen strobe, and I kept it clipped to my belt. Around midnight, I heard movement again, closer this time. The steps weren't rushed. They were slow, deliberate. I grabbed the flashlight, switched it on, and aimed it toward the sound. Nothing. The beam lit up the trees, some brush, and the empty space between. I scanned back and forth, but no eyes reflected back. No movement followed. After a few minutes, I shut it off and sat back down. But I didn't sleep. I just leaned back in my camp chair, shotgun across my lap, eyes open. At dawn, I walked the perimeter. I found more tracks, fresh ones, this time closer. One of them was behind the tent, maybe 6 feet away. I also noticed that my cooler had been tampered with. The latch was undone, though nothing was missing. That scared me more than if they'd actually taken something. That meant they were careful on purpose. They looked through my stuff but didn't want me to notice right away. I packed up everything that morning. Tent, stove, food, all of it. I didn't want to wait and see what would happen next. I figured I'd drive further east, maybe find a new spot closer to a small town. I started the truck, pulled out of the clearing, and began driving back down the same dirt road I came in on. About 2 miles down, I saw something that stopped me cold. Off to the side of the road, near that abandoned ranch I passed earlier, there was a vehicle, an old white SUV partially hidden behind some brush. It wasn't there when I came in. I slowed down, looked closer, and felt the hair on the back of my neck go up. There was a man sitting in the driver's seat, not moving, just staring at me. He didn't wave, didn't smile, just watched. I didn't stop. I pressed the gas and kept driving. I checked the rearview mirror several times, but he never pulled out or followed. Just sat there watching. I drove straight through until I reached the highway, then took the first town I could find, which was Silver City. I rented a cheap motel room for the night and barely slept. The whole time I kept checking the window, making sure no one had followed me. In the morning, I took back roads all the way home to Lubbock, avoiding anything that felt too empty or too quiet. I never reported it. What would I even say? Someone walked around my camp at night? Sat in a car watching me? Nothing technically happened, but I never forgot the feeling that someone had been watching me the whole time, testing me, seeing how far they could go without being caught. I never went back to that area. I still camp, but now I stick to designated areas, places with people nearby. I bring trail cams now. I always have a sat phone on me. I learned something important out there, not about nature, but about people. You don't always see the danger coming. Sometimes it's quiet, patient, and smiling just out of sight. And that's what stuck with me the most. Not the prints, not the noise, not even the man in the SUV. It was the fact that he never did anything, just watched, like he was waiting. I was 33 when I took a solo camping trip that I still think about more than I'd like to admit. I had just gone through a rough breakup and felt the need to be alone, far from everything. Work had been a mess, and I'd been staying in my brother's basement after moving out of the place I shared with my ex. I didn't want to see anyone, didn't want to be seen. I just wanted open air, a quiet place to think.
No phones.
No internet, just space. I grew up in Iowa, so I picked a forested area near the Iowa-Missouri border, not too far from the small town of Centerville. I'd driven through that area before and remembered seeing some deep wooded land that looked perfect for being alone. No established campsites, no facilities. I wasn't looking for comfort. I wanted total isolation. Just trees, the sky, and whatever silence I could find. I packed my gear over the course of 2 days. Nothing fancy. A 2-person tent, an old aluminum pot for boiling water, a little propane burner, my sleeping bag, a couple lighters, a multi-tool, headlamp, basic first aid, trail mix, canned food, jerky. I also packed 2 gallons of water and brought a life straw just in case. I wasn't planning on staying more than 3 nights. My brother dropped me off at a gravel pull-off off Highway 2. I didn't even tell him the exact spot I'd be camping. Just told him I'd hike south and that I'd be back by Sunday afternoon. He offered to lend me his .38, but I declined. I hadn't touched a gun in years and didn't want to bring that kind of energy with me. In hindsight, I think about that a lot. I started my hike mid-morning on Friday. The sun was high, the air warm and still. I had a big internal frame backpack on, and the straps dug into my shoulders pretty fast. The forest here wasn't national park territory. It was scrappy and underkept, the kind of woods that sat in no man's land. There were no trail signs, no marked paths, just cow-worn clearings and old game trails snaking through clusters of elm and oak. I moved steadily south, picking the most overgrown direction on purpose. I walked for hours. No cell signal, no traffic hum, nothing but the birds and bugs. Eventually, I settled on a spot near a shallow creek that ran through a thick pocket of woods. It wasn't visible from any path or clearing. That's how I wanted it. I pitched my tent between 2 leaning trees and dug a small fire pit. I set up camp in a rhythm. Tent up, pad and bag unrolled, food bag hung, gear checked. I didn't plan to make a fire that night, but I gathered some branches and dry brush anyway. I always preferred preparing before dark. As the sun lowered, the forest got louder. Crickets and frogs echoed across the creek bed, and cicadas pulsed from the treetops. I sat on a flat rock, ate jerky, and watched the orange sky filter through the trees. That first night passed without anything strange. I stayed up later than I expected, just watching the stars through the thin mesh of my tent. It was the first time in weeks I didn't feel claustrophobic. The second day, I wandered further out. I didn't take a GPS or mark trees, something I usually did but didn't bother with this time. I told myself I wouldn't go far, just loop out and back. I walked for maybe an hour, scanning for deer prints, listening to the birds. I spotted a rotted wooden fence post overgrown with moss, probably the edge of someone's land. There was no sign of any recent activity, just rusted barbed wire running through the trees like some old forgotten boundary. I turned back before noon. When I got back to camp, I noticed something that didn't sit right. My firewood pile looked different, not dramatically, just rearranged, like a few sticks had been picked through and placed back haphazardly. I stared at it for a while, convincing myself I'd misremembered how I left it. I told myself wind could have knocked things around, or maybe a raccoon, but something about it felt off. It was too deliberate. That night, I built a fire and stayed closer to my tent. I didn't eat much, just sat with the flames and listened to the woods breathe around me. After midnight, I heard rustling in the trees uphill from my camp. Not the twitchy steps of a raccoon. It was heavier, slower, deliberate. I turned off my headlamp and sat still. My fire had mostly died, and the forest was dark again. The steps moved closer, then stopped. I sat like that for half an hour, frozen, trying not to make a sound. Eventually, I convinced myself it was a deer, maybe a lost cow. The area was scattered with farmland and free-range cattle wasn't unheard of. But I couldn't shake the way it stopped and stood there, listening. I crawled into my tent and zipped it shut. I barely slept. Every sound felt sharp and meaningful. I kept gripping my multi-tool like it was a weapon, even though I knew it wouldn't do much. The next morning, the firewood was disturbed again, more obviously this time. Some pieces were stacked neatly, like someone was trying to make it look intentional. I looked around the forest. I didn't see anyone, didn't hear anything, but my gut was churning. I didn't feel alone anymore. I packed up camp slowly, debating whether I should leave. But I told myself 3 nights, and I was too stubborn to bail early. I moved my camp downhill closer to the creek. I found a flatter area with thicker tree cover, less exposed. I didn't cook that night, Just ate from the bag and kept all noise to a minimum. Right after sundown, I heard something that pulled every hair on my neck upright. It was the sound of metal scraping metal, faint but clear, like a blade being dragged against steel. It came from the direction of my old camp, maybe 30 yards off. I sat dead still. Then I heard slow, deliberate footfalls, heavy ones, breaking branches. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just laid down flat against the dirt, off to the side of my tent, hidden in the brush. I stayed there for over 2 hours, barely breathing. The noises never came closer, but they didn't leave either. At some point, I heard a low grunt, human, I think, but muffled. Then silence, like whoever or whatever was there had just stopped listening. Eventually, I crawled back into the tent. I didn't zip it shut, just laid there with the knife open in my hand, heart hammering against my ribs. The final morning, I knew I had to leave. I didn't eat. I didn't pack carefully. I crammed everything into my bag, barely folding the tent, and hiked back north in a beeline, pushing through brush, stumbling over roots. I didn't stop to rest once.
No brags.
I didn't want to give whoever was out there a chance to follow. I didn't even think about looking back. It took me 5 hours to reach the gravel pull-off. My legs were shaking, my shirt soaked through, and my throat raw. I didn't see another person on the hike out. Not one. No car passed the road as I waited. I started walking east down the highway until a family in a minivan picked me up a couple miles in and gave me a ride into Centerville. I told them my car had broken down while hiking. I stayed at a cheap motel that night. I didn't call my brother, didn't say anything about what happened. I just locked the door, turned on the TV, and sat in the bathtub with the curtain drawn, fully dressed. I needed walls. I needed to feel like something could keep me safe again. The next morning, I bought a bus ticket back to Des Moines and kept the whole thing to myself for a long time. I didn't go camping again for almost 2 years. I think the part that gets to me most isn't what I saw because I didn't see anything. It's what I felt. That constant, creeping sense that I wasn't alone. That someone was out there, not lost, not confused, but waiting, watching, moving quietly through the trees with a purpose. And the worst part? When I was unpacking my gear back home, I found something in the outer pocket of my backpack that I didn't put there. It was a small, rusted nail, bent at one end like it had been used before. It sat in my palm like a message I wasn't supposed to read. I threw it out, but I still think about it sometimes. That and the sound of metal scraping through the trees. It was early November of 2018, and I was 32 at the time. I had just transferred from patrol to a specialized rural operations unit in Oregon that focused on long-range surveillance, fugitive tracking, and rural narcotics interdiction. It was a quiet area most of the year, but there were pockets deep in the forests where things went bad fast. People set up illegal grow ops, meth cook sites, and sometimes full-on encampments. Most of them were dug deep into places that regular folks wouldn't dare to hike through, let alone try to live in. That's where we came in. That week, we had picked up a lead from a local hunter. He'd spotted a cluster of makeshift tents way off in a ravine northwest of Choco National Forest. Said there were barrels stacked up under tarps, and at night, he'd seen flickers of small fires and movement under dim lights. He didn't stick around too long, but what stuck with him was the smell. Said it was a mix of gasoline, rotting trash, and something else he couldn't place. That something else usually meant chemicals. We scoped it on satellite maps, found nothing permanent, but a narrow trail seemed worn in from a nearby Forest Service road. We figured if this camp was active, it could be a meth operation. We'd seen it before, barrels of chemicals, pressurized cookers, and guys with rifles guarding their piece of backwoods territory like it was their last stand. I was assigned point for the op. It was a 4-person team, with 2 of us pushing in from the south side under cover of darkness. The other 2 were setting up on the ridge to the north with optics and overwatch. We weren't going in guns blazing. The plan was simple: observe, confirm the criminal activity, record everything, and prepare for a takedown team to come in after daylight if needed. It started raining before sundown. That slow, cold drizzle that soaks everything even before it builds into anything steady. I hiked in with my teammate Carson, who had done 2 tours in Afghanistan before joining law enforcement. We didn't talk. We never talked during approaches. Just moved in rhythm, step after step, eyes moving, ears locked into the quiet. The forest soaked up our sounds. Pine needles underfoot, wet moss on rocks. We wore rain shells, kept our gear tight and silent. We had packed in slow from the fire road and cut west through the trees, using an old elk trail to descend toward the suspected site. There were no man-made markers, no discarded trash. Whoever was down there knew to keep a low profile. By the time we hit the ravine's lip, it was past 9 p.m. We paused to hydrate and check the GPS. The rain had gone from a drizzle to a steady curtain. Not a downpour, but enough that you couldn't hear much more than a few feet out. Through thermal optics, we spotted faint heat signatures, 3 tents, a fire pit, and at least 2 bodies moving around near the largest tent. They had no idea we were up there. They probably thought no one could reach them in the rain and dark. That assumption was what we depended on. We waited for a signal from the Overwatch team. When the confirmation blinked back in code, we moved, crawled our way downhill about 40 yards and posted in a stand of trees within visual range of the camp. From there, I could see through the leaves. Blue tarps stretched over nylon tents, ropes hung with clothes, and plastic bins stacked in a haphazard grid near a cooking station made from rusted barrels. One of them had a hose snaking into it, and I caught the faint chemical tang of acetone or something close. It wasn't just camping. It was a working cook site. We filmed. I logged coordinates, times, movements. There were 4 individuals confirmed by the second hour, 3 men, 1 woman, all wearing military surplus or old hunting gear. No one under 30. Gaunt faces, twitchy behavior. 2 of them had rifles they kept slung close even when they were just sitting near the fire, which burned low and smoky under a rain canopy. Around 11 p.m., Carson signaled he needed to shift to relieve pressure on his knee. I adjusted to cover while he moved. That's when I noticed something that wasn't there earlier. A long chain link of noise, faint but rhythmic. It didn't come from the camp. It was behind us. At first, I thought it was wind dragging through dead branches. But wind doesn't move in step patterns. I froze and waited. There was a rustle to the right. Not from Carson. This was further back. Then it stopped. A few seconds later, I felt it again, like someone was watching us. We had been cautious, but clearly someone else was in the woods now, possibly approaching the camp from another direction. Maybe someone who didn't belong to the group we were observing. Maybe someone they didn't expect either. I nudged Carson and motioned in code, movement, behind, east. Asterisk asterisk, he nodded, adjusted his rifle scope, and watched the brush. 10 minutes passed. Nothing. Then, from the other side of the camp, a flashlight flickered, brief, unpatterned, not part of the original crew. It was just a flash, maybe 2 seconds long, but in the black rain, it stood out like a beacon. I saw one of the guys in the camp snap his head in that direction. He pulled his rifle up and yelled something, muffled by the storm, but sharp in tone. 2 others joined him, and they all started scanning the tree line with their lights. Now things were unraveling. We hadn't planned for a third party. Maybe another cook group trying to scare them off. Maybe someone looking to rob them. Maybe just a desperate junkie trying to find the camp. Either way, it was escalating. We held position. I didn't dare call it in over the radio. Not yet. That would blow our position. Suddenly, a shot rang out. then two more. Not from us. The camp flared with activity. Lights flashed everywhere. One of the tents got torn open by a guy running out half-dressed, clutching a shotgun. There was shouting, then another blast. You could feel the tension crack the night open. Carson and I melted into the ground, bodies flat to the dirt, soaked through. We didn't know if the shooters were part of the group or outsiders. All we knew was that the site had turned into a live gunfight. Overwatch pinged us. They'd seen movement from the North Ridge. Someone had crept up through the brush and opened fire on the camp from above. Two men, one armed with a short-barrel shotgun, the other with a scoped deer rifle. This wasn't about meth. It was a raid, some kind of internal feud or turf war. The criminals below were firing blindly now, sweeping flashlights across the trees. One of them took a round and dropped near the tarp. The others dragged him into cover behind barrels. Carson tapped my shoulder. We had to move. It wasn't a question. We crawled backward, inch by inch, until we were back far enough to rise and make a flanking loop west. Our plan now was to circle and position ourselves to observe the attackers as well. But just then, a figure appeared in the trees to our left. No flashlight, no rain gear, just a soaked man with a pump shotgun and wild eyes. He hadn't seen us yet. I raised my weapon, finger on safety. He passed just 10 feet from us. We let him go. Engaging would have blown everything wide open. We weren't there to fight. We were there to report and survive. And now we were trapped between two sets of violent criminals. Overwatch called in a full extraction and alerted county deputies. We had 15 minutes before their team could respond. In that time, we hunkered down and documented everything. Shaky cam footage of men with rifles in the dark, gunshots echoing through the trees, shadows moving like ghosts but very real, very armed. By the time the deputies arrived, the shooting had mostly stopped. Two men lay dead. One from the original group, one from the attackers. A third man, wounded and delirious, was found stumbling down the ravine with a bullet in his thigh. The rain kept falling, soaking the evidence, smearing blood into the mud, washing footprints into nothing. But we had the footage, the recordings, the witness accounts. Turned out the attackers were part of a rival group trying to poach the Cook site. They'd been watching from the hills for weeks. The camp we had scoped had no idea they were being stalked until that night. We'd walked into a boiling storm of paranoia and desperation. We spent the next 3 days writing reports, cataloging footage, testifying in hearings. I barely slept. Carson blew out his knee on the hike out and took leave for months. I stayed on, transferred to another part of the state. But that night followed me. What I remember most wasn't the shooting or the dead bodies or the crawling in cold mud. It was the eyes of that man with the shotgun, walking through the trees like he didn't care if he lived or died. He was too far gone to feel fear. That stuck with me more than anything. We weren't heroes. We didn't save anyone that night. We didn't stop the camp or the raid. We just saw what happened when isolation, drugs, and desperation twist people into something else. But we got out. We lived. We brought back the truth. Sometimes that's all you can do. I went camping alone in the Black Hills of South Dakota in the summer of 2016. I was 29 then, living in Omaha, Nebraska, working in a warehouse. Nothing fancy. I just needed to get away from everything for a few days. My job was eating me alive. Long hours, noisy forklifts, back pain. I needed quiet, no phones, no people. Just trees and open sky. I picked a spot deep in the National Forest, a little southeast of Custer. Not near Mount Rushmore, but far enough from the tourist stuff. I wanted somewhere that felt untouched. I'd found a clearing on an old map online, about 2 miles off a logging road. There were no official trails nearby, no campgrounds, No other cars when I parked mine under some trees at the start of the dirt track. I brought a 60-liter pack with a small tent, sleeping bag, basic food, a hatchet, a folding saw, some paracord, a headlamp, and 2 canteens. I also brought a Ruger .22 pistol. Not much, but enough to keep raccoons out of my food or scare off a coyote if one got too bold. It was mid-June, and the weather was perfect. Warm in the day, cool at night, barely any wind. Birds chirped. Leaves whispered when a breeze passed through. The hike to the clearing took a little over an hour. It was uphill most of the way, but not brutal. I passed fallen logs, small creeks, and the old remnants of fire pits people had made probably years ago. Nothing fresh. I liked that. The clearing wasn't big, maybe 30 feet across, surrounded on all sides by thick pine and spruce. I picked a spot on the edge where the ground was soft but dry, near a small rock ledge that faced west. I set up my tent, gathered some dead branches for a small fire later, and boiled some water to rehydrate a freeze-dried meal. As the sun went down, the sky turned orange through the trees. It was quiet except for insects and the occasional snapping twig from a squirrel or something. That first night was peaceful. I sat on a log, ate, and watched the fire crackle down to glowing coals. I went to bed when it got fully dark, which was around 9:30. The forest sounds were soothing. Crickets, leaves shifting. My mind slowed down. I felt better than I had in months. The next morning, I woke up early, a little after 6. Birds were loud already. I had a quick breakfast, some oatmeal and jerky, and packed a small bag for a day hike. I didn't plan to go too far, just wanted to stretch my legs and maybe find a stream. I wandered northeast for a while, weaving through tall trees and mossy rocks. I came across what looked like a game trail, maybe deer or elk, and followed it for a bit. It led downhill and eventually opened into a shallow valley with a creek running through it. I refilled my canteens with filtered water, sat on a rock, and just listened for a while. No traffic.
No voices.
Just wind and water. That's the kind of silence I was looking for. I stayed there maybe 45 minutes before heading back. It took me a little longer than I expected to find my way back to camp, mostly because I didn't mark my path well. I got turned around once or twice, but I wasn't panicked. I recognized a forked tree I passed earlier and knew I was close. When I got back, everything was fine. Tent was still there. Nothing touched, but something was off that night. Around sunset, I had just finished dinner and was getting ready to put the fire out. That's when I thought I saw movement at the edge of the clearing. A flicker of something, not an animal too tall. I stood up and scanned the trees, but there was nothing. I told myself it was a shadow, my eyes playing tricks. Still, I felt different after that, like I wasn't alone. I stayed up later than usual, just sitting by the fire, listening. At one point, I heard a faint crack, like a stick breaking, maybe 20 or 30 yards into the woods. I froze. It wasn't fast like a running deer. It was one deliberate sound, then silence again. I reached for the .22 and held it across my lap. It didn't make me feel much safer, but it was something. I stayed up until the fire burned down to ash. When I finally crawled into the tent, I didn't fall asleep right away. I lay there listening, heart thumping, ears tuned to every sound. Eventually, exhaustion won. The next day, I tried to brush it off. I figured I was just spooking myself. It's easy to do that when you're alone out there. I went for another walk, but I didn't go as far. Stayed within earshot of the camp. I came back early and spent the afternoon carving a stick, just to keep my hands busy. I didn't want to admit it, but I didn't like the idea of staying another night. That evening, right around the same time, sun almost down, orange glow in the trees, I saw it again. Movement, but this time it wasn't quick. I looked up and saw a man standing about 20 feet into the woods, just barely visible between two trees. He was wearing dark clothes,
No pack. No gear.
just standing there, facing me. I didn't move. I didn't say anything. My heart was pounding. I stared at him for what felt like a full minute. He didn't speak, didn't wave, just stood there. Then, without turning, he stepped back behind the tree and disappeared. I didn't even pack up. I grabbed the gun, the flashlight, and climbed into the tent. I zipped it shut and sat there in the dark, listening. I didn't light a fire. I didn't want to give him any more reason to come closer. Every leaf that moved, every stick that cracked, I flinched. I didn't sleep. At some point past midnight, I heard something outside. Light footsteps on the edge of the clearing. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. I held the gun in both hands, aimed toward the front of the tent, barely breathing. The steps circled around, slow, measured. They stopped for a long time right near my fire pit, then moved again, then silence. I don't remember falling asleep, but I must have at some point. When I opened my eyes, it was morning. I sat up and unzipped the tent just a little. Everything looked normal. Fire pit untouched, trees still, no sign of anyone. But when I stepped outside, I saw footprints, real clear boot prints, deep ones. They circled my tent twice. They weren't mine. My boots had a different tread. I checked. These were wider, flatter. The prints went off into the woods in a direction I hadn't walked before. I packed everything in 15 minutes.
No breakfast.
No water. I shoved gear into my bag, collapsed the tent without rolling it, and left. I didn't follow the same path back. I didn't care. I just moved downhill toward the road, keeping my pistol out the whole time. My legs hurt. I tripped once, scraped my knee. I didn't stop. When I finally saw the road, I almost cried. My car was still there. I threw the pack into the trunk, locked the doors, and started it without even changing out of my boots. I drove 4 hours straight, didn't stop for food or gas until I hit the edge of Sioux Falls. I never reported it. What would I even say? Some guy watched me from the woods? I had no proof, no name, nothing. But I think about it often. How long was he watching me? Was he there the first night? What would have happened if I hadn't woken up? What if I didn't leave that morning? I haven't camped alone since. I'm not sure what pushed me to go alone that year. Maybe it was turning 31. Maybe it was how burnt out I was working shifts at that distribution warehouse in Akron. Maybe it was just the silence I wanted. I'd always liked being out in the woods, but it had been a few years since I'd taken a trip on my own. In late September 2022, I got the time off I asked for, packed up my gear, and drove out to a place I hadn't been since I was in my 20s. A stretch of forest up past the East Ridge area of West Virginia, not too far from the Virginia border. Most people hit the marked trails or state parks. I preferred the quiet spots where cell service dropped and I didn't see another person for days. This particular place wasn't officially marked. It was an old fire road that peeled off from a half-paved county route about 10 miles north of a small town called Elkins. I remembered it from years ago when a friend and I had hiked the area. The road was rutted and forgotten, steep in parts, barely a road at all. But at the end of it, tucked into a high pocket of forest, was a small clearing beside a creek. It had a flat area just big enough for a tent, fire ring, and a chair. Nobody ever came up that far. At least that's what I thought. Took me most of the afternoon to get there. My old Tacoma didn't love the rocky slope up the fire road, and I had to stop twice to clear branches and debris. Once I reached the top and parked by the edge of the clearing, I felt that familiar mix of peace and adrenaline. I was completely alone. Trees circled the site like silent guards, and the only sound was the creek bubbling nearby. I set up camp slowly, pitched the tent, laid out my sleeping bag and mat, got the firewood stacked. Everything felt still. Cool, dry air and golden late-day sun coming through the trees. I figured I'd spend 3 nights up there. Maybe hike a ridge trail I remembered. Fish the creek. Sleep. Think. Nothing complicated. The first night was calm. I made a small fire, heated up a can of chili, and watched the sky go dark. No animals made any sounds that I noticed. Even the bugs were quiet. I figured it was just the time of year. The woods felt dry. Before bed, I walked a short loop from my tent to the creek and back, just stretching my legs, flashlight off, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. I was never nervous in the woods. I knew what was out there. Coyotes, maybe a bear, deer, porcupines, raccoons, but nothing I hadn't handled before. I fell asleep around 10, woke up once around 2 a.m. when I heard a branch snap somewhere behind my tent. I sat up, listened. Nothing followed. Could have been a deer. Could have been something falling from a tree. I lay back down, heart beating a little faster, but eventually fell asleep again. The second day, I hiked east from the site, followed the creek upstream a few miles. It narrowed into a sharper run, lots of slick rock and moss. I didn't see any tracks or boot prints. I didn't even hear planes overhead. It was perfect isolation. On the way back, I marked a few turns with small stone piles just in case I came back through. At the camp, I noticed a strange smell hanging in the air. Not strong, faint, sour, like old meat. I checked my cooler, made sure nothing had leaked. All the food was still sealed, still cold. I sniffed around a bit, couldn't figure it out. Figured maybe it was just a dead animal somewhere in the brush. That night was when things shifted. I made a fire again. I sat for a long time staring into the coals. When it got dark, I thought about walking again but decided against it. Something felt off. I crawled into the tent just after 9. I left my boots just inside the door like I always do and kept my knife and flashlight next to my sleeping bag. Around 3 a.m., I woke up suddenly. Not from a noise, but from the feeling. That sense when something changes, even when you don't know what it is. I was sweating. My sleeping bag felt too hot. I unzipped it and sat up slowly. The woods were absolutely silent.
No breeze. No bugs.
No water sounds. The fire had long since burned out, so the darkness outside was thick. I turned on my flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent door halfway. The beam lit up the clearing, trees, fire pit, my folding chair, truck parked off to the side. Nothing moved. But then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. My boots weren't where I left them. They were outside, placed side by side, about 5 feet from the tent. I didn't move, just stared at them. That wasn't a mistake I'd make. I never leave gear out like that, especially not boots. I didn't hear anyone. No steps.
No voices.
And yet there they were, just sitting neatly outside. I pulled the knife into my lap, sat still for at least an hour, flashlight off again, trying to listen. I couldn't hear anything. Nothing came close. Nothing moved. I don't even know when I fell asleep again, but when the light started to come through the tent, I sat up fast and checked again. Boots were still there, damp from dew. No animal tracks. No signs of a person. I walked a slow perimeter of the clearing.
No prints.
No broken brush. But the feeling wouldn't leave me, that someone had come through. Someone quiet. I debated packing up, but I told myself it could have been an animal. Maybe a raccoon dragging them out, though I'd never seen one do that. Maybe I moved them myself and forgot. It wasn't the first time I'd been overtired. Still, I couldn't shake it. That third day, I didn't hike. I stayed close to the site. Tried to fish, but didn't focus. My eyes kept scanning the woods. I even sat in the truck for a while, just thinking. At one point, I checked the road behind the clearing, just to see if anyone might have driven up after me. The dirt was untouched. No new tire tracks. Not even boot prints on the sides. It got cold that night, fast. I skipped the fire and stayed in the tent. I kept the flashlight in my hand. I think I dozed off maybe twice, but each time I woke up panicked. Around 1:30 a.m., I heard footsteps. Clear ones. Not a deer. Slow. One step. Then a pause. Another step. They stopped just outside the tent. I held my breath. Didn't move. Didn't blink. I didn't hear breathing. I didn't hear retreating steps. Just silence after that. I lay there frozen until the sun started to rise. When I finally unzipped the tent, I saw something new. A small pile of pebbles, right in front of the flap. Stacked, not scattered, not natural. I packed up in 10 minutes. I didn't even eat. I threw everything into the truck bed, gear, chair, cooler, even the tent without folding it properly. I peeled out and bounced down the road harder than I should have. I didn't stop until I hit pavement again. Back in Elkins, I got a motel room. I checked the truck, the gear. Nothing stolen. No signs anyone followed. I even washed the boots just in case. But I couldn't shake it. Someone had been out there, watching, moving quietly enough not to wake me, leaving things, touching things, but never showing themselves. I didn't report it. What would I even say? That someone stacked pebbles near my tent? That someone moved my boots? But I never went back. And I never camped alone again. The worst part wasn't knowing someone was there. The worst part was knowing they wanted me to know. And they still never let me see them. I was 32 years old when I took part in something that I still think about every night. It happened in the summer of 2016. In a place called Walker's Ridge, about 3 hours north of Spokane, Washington. I was working as a seasonal ranger, helping with trail inspections, fire watch, and the usual Forest Service stuff. I'd done a couple years of military service before this, nothing special, just standard infantry, and after that, I drifted for a while. This job was steady. It gave me a reason to stay outside and avoid people for the most part. The story really begins when my supervisor, a guy named Carl, pulled me aside one day. There had been some reports from campers over the past few weeks. Missing gear, strange noises at night, tents slashed, small stuff like that. Nothing dramatic, no one had been hurt. But it was odd. The Rangers were stretched thin, and Carl knew I had a background that might be useful if things got out of hand. He wanted me to head up a quiet operation. Not official, not on paper, just a little solo patrol with the possibility of staying a few nights out there. I didn't argue. I packed my gear, kept it light but sharp. Tent, sleeping bag, MREs, canteen, med kit, and my sidearm, which I only ever carried on backcountry patrols where bears were a concern. Carl signed it out for me and said to keep the radio off unless it was an emergency. I hiked in on a Tuesday morning. The sky was clear, but you could smell the summer storms brewing in the distance. My target area was a bend in the river past Elkstone Trail, maybe 12 miles in. It was a quiet spot, not too trafficked except during holidays. But lately, the reports had all come from somewhere around that area. The plan was to camp for 3 nights and just observe. Listen, see if anything weird happened. The first night was uneventful. I set up near the edge of the tree line, not too close to the river. I didn't want to be exposed. Made a small fire, cooked a simple meal, and stayed alert. The forest was calm. A couple of owls, the wind in the pines, the usual chorus of bugs. Nothing out of place. I did a sweep before turning in, made sure my gear was tucked in tight, and got some sleep. The second day, I hiked a wider loop around the area. I didn't find much. A couple of old fire pits, some scattered wrappers, maybe 2 or 3 old campsites. One of them caught my eye. There were scraps of nylon hanging from a branch, torn up in a way that didn't look like weather or animals. I noted the GPS and moved on. Around noon, the sky darkened and thunder started up. I made it back to camp just before the rain hit. That night was different. The rain made everything quiet. It muffled the normal sounds, turned the forest into a dead zone of dripping branches and distant thunder. I sat up for hours listening. At one point, maybe around 2 a.m., I thought I saw movement down the ridge. Just a flicker. Could have been wind or an animal. But it put me on edge. I didn't sleep well. The third day, I followed the ridgeline east, deeper into the woods. It was harder going, more overgrown. That's where I found the trap. It was crude but functional. A pit with sharp branches at the bottom, barely covered with moss and leaves. Someone had made it by hand. Not an animal trap either. This was big enough for a person. My skin crawled. I took photos and marked it. I wasn't sure what the hell I was dealing with now. I considered radioing in but decided to wait. I didn't want to alert anyone who might be watching. Back at camp that night, I set up a dummy sleeping bag with some spare clothes. Then I moved about 40 yards off into the trees, dug myself into a little blind, and waited. It was about 3 a.m. when I saw him. He came from the direction of the ridge. He moved slow, deliberate, didn't have a flashlight. He paused every few steps like he was listening. Tall, lean, maybe mid-40s. He was wearing old camo gear, the kind you'd find at a surplus store. I could barely see him in the dark, but my eyes had adjusted. He crept up to the dummy tent and just stood there. 5 minutes passed. Then he took out a knife and slashed the tent once, twice, quick, like he was expecting someone inside. I didn't move. I kept my hand on my sidearm, but I didn't make a sound. He didn't find anything, obviously, but he lingered. Then he walked off toward the river. I followed. It was risky, but I stayed back far enough to avoid being spotted. He didn't use any light, so he was either familiar with the area or just crazy enough to move blind. After about 15 minutes, we reached a small clearing near the riverbank. That's when I saw the camp. It was hidden well. Tarps stretched between trees, gear piled under camo netting, and something that looked like a smoker made from an old oil drum. I didn't get closer. I circled wide, took mental notes, and pulled back. At dawn, I made a decision. I hiked 2 miles out and found a high spot where I could get radio signal. I called Carl and told him everything. What I saw, the trap, the man, the hidden camp. He told me to sit tight and keep an eye on things, but not to engage. Reinforcements were coming the next morning. They didn't want a firefight in the woods. I agreed, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I saw. That guy wasn't just messing with tents. He had something else going on out there. I stayed hidden that whole day, watched the area from a high perch with binoculars. Around midday, he came back. He didn't look worried, just moved around his little camp, tending the fire, sharpening a blade. At one point, he strung something up from a tree. I couldn't tell what it was from that distance. That night, I moved closer. I knew I wasn't supposed to do anything, but I needed to know what was going on before anyone else walked into it blind. I crawled into position just before midnight. He was sleeping on a tarp, covered by a wool blanket. There were tools nearby, machete, axe, knives. Everything looked worn, used. I scanned the area again, and that's when I saw the cooler. It was off to the side, half buried under a camo tarp. I slid over to it, inch by inch, heart pounding. Opened it slow. Inside were pieces of clothing, shoes, a phone, a small child's backpack, and something worse beneath that, bones, small ones. My stomach turned. I backed away, careful not to make a sound. My brain was buzzing. This wasn't just a disturbed loner. This was a killer, and I was maybe 50 feet away from him. At that point, I knew I couldn't just wait for backup. What if he moved? What if he disappeared? I didn't want to lose him, so I went back to my blind, waited until dawn, then made a hard choice. I snuck back to the trailhead and intercepted the team. 2 law enforcement rangers and 1 state trooper. I gave them all the info, took them back in, and we planned a takedown. We waited until dusk when he was preparing his fire. The approach was quiet, coordinated. He didn't hear us until the last second. I watched from behind a tree with my weapon drawn. When he stood up and reached for something, the trooper fired a warning shot into the dirt. The man froze. For a second, I thought he might run, but he dropped his hands and went still. They cuffed him without a fight. After that, things moved fast. Forensics, crime scene teams, dogs. They tore through his camp for days. They found more remains buried in shallow graves nearby. 3 confirmed victims. One of them was a boy who'd been missing since the spring. The man's name was Eric Fallon. No prior convictions. A loner, off the grid for years. He had IDs from his victims, old Polaroids, a journal with names and dates. He kept it all like trophies. They thanked me, said I helped crack a case that had been cold for months. But I didn't feel good about it. I couldn't sleep for weeks. I kept thinking about how close I was to that guy, how easy it would have been for him to find me first. I left the ranger job that fall, moved south, got into private security, never went camping again. Sometimes I think about that third night, the way he crept up to my tent with a knife in his hand, expecting to find someone inside. The way he didn't hesitate. He wasn't crazy. He was calculated, patient, like a predator. And I still wonder what would have happened if I hadn't set that dummy tent. If I'd stayed asleep, exposed, in the real one. But I didn't, and I'm still here. That's the part one hold on to. I had planned the trip for weeks. It was early October 2016, and the weather in northern Arizona was finally starting to cool off. I was 33 back then, working construction jobs on and off, and had just finished a long 3-month stretch on a site outside Flagstaff. I had a few days to myself before the next job started, and I wanted to spend them in the woods. Alone, quiet, away from everything. I'd done solo camping before, but this time I wanted something deeper in, off the marked trails. Just me, the forest, and no one else around. I drove out early one morning in my old pickup, leaving town before sunrise. My destination was a remote area in the Kaibab National Forest, a few hours north. I'd found a spot on a map, no official campground, no fire rings, no toilets. Just a flat clearing by a small creek, about a half-mile hike from a narrow Forest Service road. Perfect. I'd loaded up my gear the night before. Tent, sleeping bag, enough food for 2 nights, extra water, a small stove, headlamp, knife, hatchet, and a flare gun I kept in my glove box for emergencies. I brought a small pistol too, a .38 revolver I kept mostly for peace of mind. The drive was uneventful. I got off the pavement and onto the dirt road by late morning, followed the narrow path deeper into the forest until it got too rough for the truck. I parked under a thick canopy of pines, slung my pack over my shoulder, and locked up. The air was cool and smelled like dried pine needles and sap. The forest was quiet. No traffic, no people, just the soft rustling of wind in the branches. It took me about 30 minutes to reach the clearing. The terrain was uneven, scattered with fallen logs and thick undergrowth. I kept checking my compass to stay oriented, even though the direction was mostly straight. When I reached the clearing, I paused and looked around. It was better than I imagined. A gentle slope led down to a narrow creek. The ground was soft but dry, with enough space for my tent and a small fire if I wanted one. The trees formed a tight wall on 3 sides, making it feel like a natural shelter. I dropped my pack and stretched out my back. It was just past noon, and I took my time setting up camp. Tent first, then gathering dry wood from nearby for a fire later. I boiled some water for coffee and sat by the creek with a granola bar, watching the way the sunlight cut through the trees and danced on the water. I hadn't seen a single soul since I left the truck. It was peaceful in that way you can only get when you know no one else is around. No cell signal, no voices, no traffic noise in the distance. Just birds, the trickling stream, and the wind. I wandered a little upstream in the afternoon, keeping an eye on landmarks so I wouldn't get turned around. Found some animal tracks, probably deer, maybe elk. No signs of bears or anything big, which was good. I took a few pictures with my phone, even though I knew they'd just sit there for months before I looked at them again. By the time I got back to the tent, the sun was getting low behind the trees. The temperature dropped fast. I lit a small fire, ate a meal of rice and beans I'd cooked on the stove, and sat there for a while just listening. Every little crack or rustle in the dark felt louder than it probably was. I kept my flashlight close and my revolver in my coat pocket. I wasn't nervous exactly, just aware. I crawled into the tent around 9, zipped the flap tight, and tucked into my sleeping bag. It was cold but manageable. I lay there for a while, listening. The wind had picked up. Pine branches groaned above me. Once or twice, I heard something moving outside. Maybe a raccoon or a fox. I didn't get up to check. I just stayed still, kept my ears sharp, and eventually drifted off. I don't know what time it was when I first woke up. The tent was dark, and everything was still. Then I heard a sound. Not an animal sound. Something closer, like a soft thump, maybe 30 feet away. I froze, waited, nothing. Then another, and another. Footsteps. At first, I told myself it was probably a deer, but they were too slow, too heavy. Crunch, pause, crunch, then silence. My heart was racing. I didn't move, just stared at the top of the tent, trying to breathe quietly. I reached slowly into my coat for the revolver and gripped it tight. 10 minutes passed, maybe more. No more sounds. I convinced myself I imagined it. Branches falling, or maybe an animal moved through and was gone now. I lay there for another hour, fully awake, gun still in hand. Eventually, I started to relax, though I didn't fall asleep again. Around 5, the sky started to lighten. I waited until I could see clearly through the tent walls before unzipping the flap and stepping outside. The clearing looked normal. The fire pit was cold, untouched, no branches out of place. I walked the perimeter, looking for prints, anything. I didn't find much, but near the trees, about where I thought I heard the sounds, there was an area where the pine needles had been disturbed, flattened, like someone had walked through slowly. No clear footprints, just a vague trail. I stayed alert all morning. I even walked back to the truck just to make sure no one had messed with it. Everything looked fine. I debated leaving but told myself it was nothing. Maybe just a lone hiker passing through. Still, I kept the revolver close all day. That afternoon, I didn't wander far. I stayed near the tent, packed a few things just in case. I skipped the fire that night. Just heated some food quick on the stove and ate it inside the tent. I kept the headlamp on and stayed dressed. Slept with the gun in my hand. Every sound made me jump. The wind never stopped. I thought I heard movement once or twice but never saw anything. Then, sometime in the night, I heard it again. This time closer. Not footsteps, something sharper. A snapping twig just outside the tent. Then a long pause. I sat up fast, heart pounding, revolver raised at the door. I didn't make a sound. Something brushed the tent wall. Not hard, just a light sweep, like someone dragging a stick or a hand along the outside. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. Then it was gone. Total silence. I waited there, arm cramping from holding the gun up so long. 10 minutes passed. Nothing. 30 minutes. Still nothing. I sat like that until the sun came up. As soon as there was light, I threw everything into my pack and broke down the tent as fast as I could. Didn't eat, didn't drink. Just got moving. I moved fast but careful, checking behind me every few steps. When I got back to the truck, everything was still there, untouched. I threw my gear in the back, climbed in, locked the doors, and sat there for a few minutes before turning the key. I didn't stop until I was back in Flagstaff. Didn't sleep right for a few nights after that. I never saw anyone. I never heard any voices. But someone was out there, watching, moving, standing close enough to touch the tent. I don't know if it was just some lost hiker, a hunter, or someone looking to scare people off. Maybe they didn't mean harm, but they didn't try to talk, didn't leave, and didn't make themselves known. They came close, too close. That trip changed how I camp. I don't go off-trail alone anymore. I let people know where I'm going. I bring a satellite communicator now, and I always trust my gut. If something feels off, I leave. I still think about that night sometimes. About the slow, deliberate footsteps. About that soft brush on the tent wall. About how quiet it all was. Whoever it was, they knew I was in there. They knew exactly where I was sleeping, and they chose not to leave. That's what stays with me. It was in October of 2019, just outside a small town in rural Pennsylvania called Mercer. I was 28 then, and I'd been trying to get away from city life for a bit. Everything had started to feel too loud, too rushed, too crowded. I needed space and silence, something quiet enough that I could hear myself breathe. That's when I got the idea to camp alone for a weekend. Not in a park or a campground, somewhere strange, somewhere I hadn't been before. I'd heard from a local guy at a bait shop about an old graveyard tucked deep in the woods north of the highway. He told me no one really went out there anymore, not even the local teens. It had stopped being maintained a long time ago. The entrance was overgrown and hard to find. That sounded like exactly what I wanted. I packed light but carefully. One-person tent, sleeping bag, camp stove, basic food, water, flashlight, knife, small first aid kit. I also brought a notebook and my camera. I'd gotten into the habit of documenting solo camping trips as a kind of journal, something I could look back on later. I left my phone in airplane mode and stuffed it into the side of my bag. No signal out there anyway. The hike into the woods took longer than I thought. I parked off the shoulder of a quiet two-lane road, the kind that feels like it hasn't seen a new car in weeks, and followed what was left of a dirt path that winded downhill into the tree line. The forest was thick, mostly maple and beech, and the ground was soft with leaves and old rain. There was a rusted gate that marked the edge of the old graveyard, half collapsed and hidden behind brush. If I hadn't been looking for it, I would have walked right past. The headstones inside were old and weathered, most of them so worn you couldn't read the names anymore. Some had sunk deep into the soil, others tilted sideways like they'd been pushed by years of wind and snow. It didn't feel creepy at first, just forgotten. I set up my tent in the flattest corner I could find, near a half-cracked stone marked 1869, the date barely visible. It wasn't a large graveyard, maybe 20 or 30 stones in total, but the trees had grown close around it, swallowing the clearing in a kind of dim light even though it was just mid-afternoon. It was silent, too. No wind, no bird calls, no insects, just stillness. After getting everything set up, I walked around the site, taking photos of the stones, the moss-covered trees, the gate. I didn't touch anything. I just looked, trying to imagine the people who might have been buried here. It looked like a family plot or maybe a tiny church once stood nearby. There were no structures left, though, just forest. I cooked a small meal around 6 p.m., just rice and beans from a camp stove, then sat on a fold-out pad next to my tent. I had a small thermos of coffee and watched the sky darken through the branches. It got cold fast. A dry, sharp kind of cold that slips through your jacket and sits in your bones. I zipped into my sleeping bag early and lay back listening to the distant creaks of the woods. No animals, no distant road noise. Just the sound of my own breath and the occasional crack of wood shifting. That first night passed uneventfully. I woke up a few times to adjust, but nothing unusual happened. In the morning, I boiled some water for instant oatmeal and spent a few hours just exploring the surrounding woods, not straying too far from camp. I didn't see anyone. Not a footprint, not a can, not a wrapper. Felt like no one had walked this ground in years. That was part of the appeal. But the second night felt different. Started small, just a feeling I couldn't quite shake. As I sat eating a cold dinner out of a can, some pre-packed pasta thing, I realized I hadn't heard a single animal since I got there. No squirrels, no owls, not even a single insect buzzing around. It's the kind of thing you don't notice until you do, and then once you notice it, it won't leave your mind. Around 8:30 p.m., just after the last light faded from the sky, I heard what sounded like something heavy being dropped in the woods. Not close, but not far either. Maybe 100 feet beyond the edge of the graveyard. A single thud, like a log falling or something solid hitting dirt. It wasn't wind, I knew that. It wasn't a branch snapping. It was weight hitting ground. I turned off my little lantern and sat there in the dark, breathing slowly. I told myself it was nothing. Old trees, loose soil, things fall all the time. But I couldn't ignore the second sound, or the third. They weren't spaced far apart. 5, maybe 10 minutes between them. Each time it came from a different direction. Always beyond the graveyard, never inside it. I walked quietly to the edge of the clearing and stood just behind a headstone, peering out between the trees. There was nothing to see, just shadows and blackness. I tried to listen for footsteps or voices, anything human. But all I got was the sound of those dull impacts, irregular but deliberate. I stayed awake most of that night. I didn't want to pack up and hike back in the dark. It was too easy to get lost or hurt out here, but I also didn't feel right. The woods were pressing in. I lay in my sleeping bag with the knife under my pillow, eyes open, listening. At some point, I must have drifted off. I woke up to a sound right outside the tent. It wasn't a step. Not exactly. It was softer than that, like something moving carefully, slow, controlled. I held my breath and strained to hear. The sound came again. A scrape across fabric, then the faint crunch of dirt under weight. My chest felt tight. I didn't move, just listened. Whatever it was circling the tent. I waited until the sound stopped. Minutes passed, maybe 20, maybe more. Finally, I unzipped the flap just a little, just enough to peek outside. The ground looked undisturbed. No tracks, no sign of anything. But I noticed something that hadn't been there before. One of the headstones, an upright marker I'd taken a photo of earlier, was lying flat on the ground, like it had been pushed over. I hadn't heard it fall. It was only about 30 feet from the tent. That morning, I packed everything up as fast as I could. I didn't eat. I didn't even roll up my sleeping bag, just stuffed it into the pack. I left the tent standing, not caring if I had to come back for it later. I hiked back the way I came, pushing through brush, branches scratching my face and arms. I didn't stop until I reached my car. I drove straight into town and went to a small diner on the edge of Mercer. I ordered coffee and eggs and sat at the counter, trying to settle my hands. I pulled out my camera and flipped through the photos I'd taken the day before. The headstones, the trees, the path. Everything looked normal, except one picture caught my eye. I don't even remember taking it. It was angled low, like I'd accidentally pressed the shutter while holding the camera down. It showed the forest floor, some leaves, the edge of a shoe mine, I think, and behind that, in the far background, something that looked like a person standing between two trees. It was just a blur, mostly shadow, but it had a shape. A straight back, shoulders, no clear face. I zoomed in, trying to make out details, but the quality broke down. Whatever it was, it hadn't made a sound. It hadn't shown up in any other photos. Just that one, that blur. I deleted it. I don't know why. I just didn't want it on the camera anymore. I went back for my tent the next day. I brought a friend that time, someone from town who was familiar with the woods. We found the graveyard again, and everything looked the same, except 2 more stones had been knocked over. My tent was untouched, but something had slashed through the outer layer of the rainfly. A long, clean cut, like with a knife or a blade. Not a tear, not something an animal would do. I didn't camp again for almost a year after that. When I finally did, I stuck to marked parks and trails, places with people around. I never went back to that graveyard. I never found out who or what was out there with me that night. But I know what I felt, that I was being watched. Not in a vague ghost story way, but in a very real, very present way. Like someone had been waiting for me to fall asleep. Like they wanted to get close without being seen. Sometimes I still wonder what would have happened if I hadn't woken up. I was 33 years old in the fall of 2019 when I decided to take a solo camping trip out in the Black Hills of South Dakota. I had been through a long stretch of burnout from work, personal stuff piling up behind it, bills, a breakup, family things I didn't want to think about. I was tired in a way that felt bone deep. It wasn't the kind of tired you fix with sleep. I didn't want to be around people, and I didn't want to talk about how I felt, so I packed my gear, loaded my truck, and drove west until I found a stretch of forest that was far enough from everything. I parked off a Forest Service road and hiked in a good 2 miles before setting up camp near a small stream. The trees were thick in that area, mostly pine, and they shut out a lot of the daylight even before the sun started dipping. The air was cool and wet, the kind that carries the sharp scent of pine sap and old leaves. My tent was a 2-person dome setup I'd had for years. I laid out a ground tarp, set up the poles, staked everything down, and arranged my gear inside. Sleeping bag, foam mat, dry clothes in a waterproof bag, a couple MREs, and my small camp stove. It was late afternoon by the time everything was set up, and the clouds had already begun to creep in. I wasn't surprised. The forecast had mentioned rain sometime that night. I wasn't worried. I camped in the rain before plenty of times. I even liked it sometimes, the sound of it hitting the tent, the way it made everything feel distant and quiet. I had a good tent and a dry place to sleep. That's all I needed. I spent the next hour gathering firewood. I looked for dry wood up under trees and dead branches I could break off. It was slow work since everything had a dampness to it, but I managed enough to get a fire going with some patience and help from a fire starter brick. Once the fire caught, I sat back on a foldable stool and stared at it. There was something deeply satisfying about a campfire when you're out by yourself. I wasn't thinking about anything important, just watching the flames move. It started raining just before sunset. At first, it was a light mist, then a steady pattering. I pulled the rain cover tighter over the tent, zipped the windows, and shifted the firewood under a tarp I'd hung between 2 trees. My jacket was waterproof and warm, but the rain had a way of getting everywhere. I made a quick dinner, one of the MREs I brought, heated with the camp stove, and ate while standing, watching the sky get darker. The fire had started to hiss under the drizzle, and I let it burn down to coals before putting it out completely. By the time I climbed into the tent, the rain was coming down harder. I pulled off my wet jacket, stripped to dry thermal layers, and got into my sleeping bag. I lay there listening to the rain. It was heavy but not violent, just steady and loud, like white noise. I drifted off after a while, not exactly asleep but not fully awake either. It was that floating space where your thoughts blend with dreams. I don't know how long I was out before I heard the first sound that didn't belong. First, I thought it was the wind. It had picked up outside, and the trees groaned a little with it. But then I heard something else, something that didn't match the wind or the rain. It was a short, sharp crack, like a branch snapping under pressure. That wasn't too unusual. branches fall in the rain all the time. I told myself not to overthink it. I pulled the sleeping bag tighter, adjusted the small camping knife I kept by my mat, and closed my eyes again. But then I heard it again. Another crack, closer this time. I opened my eyes. I lay still, listening. My heartbeat had picked up a little. Not panic, but alert. A branch breaking in the woods at night could be anything. A deer, maybe a raccoon. Even a tree leaning the wrong way under the rain's weight. But the way it sounded, it wasn't random. It had rhythm, pattern. One crack, pause, another, then silence. I sat up slowly. I turned off the little lantern hanging above me to avoid casting a glow through the tent fabric. I stayed still for a long time, trying to listen past the rain. I couldn't hear anything now, just water on nylon and the creak of trees. I told myself it was nothing and lay back down. But a few minutes later, I heard something that made me go cold. It was the sound of movement, wet ground giving under weight. Not the skittering of a small animal. Not the kind of sudden, startled sound you get from a deer bolting. It was slower than that. Careful, like someone walking. I reached for the knife beside me. I didn't move otherwise. My eyes were open wide in the dark, and I breathed as quietly as I could. The sound had stopped again. Nothing but rain and wind now. After what felt like 10 minutes of stillness, I unzipped the sleeping bag halfway and got into a crouch. I had no flashlight on, didn't want to be seen, but I had one in my jacket pocket near the door. I reached slowly, feeling for it. Then something touched the tent. Not a branch, not falling water. Something touched the side of the tent wall, just beside where my shoulder had been. It was a tap, then another. I froze solid. No one was supposed to be out here. I hadn't seen a soul on the way in. This was deep forest. No official campsites, no cabins nearby. The nearest road was 2 miles behind me. The tap came again, light but deliberate. I didn't speak. I didn't make a sound. I just crouched there, gripping the handle of the knife, heart thudding so loud I felt it in my teeth. Then nothing. The tapping stopped. No more movement. Just rain again. I waited. Minutes passed. Eventually, I gathered the nerve to unzip the tent slowly and peek outside, knife in hand. The rain was pouring now. The ground was slick and shining under the gray blur of my flashlight. I scanned the trees. Nothing.
Nos chaps.
No movement. No one. I stepped out, crouched low. The rain hit my head and shoulders hard. I moved quickly and quietly, sweeping the light across the trees, the rocks, the tarp. Nothing. I looked for footprints near the tent, but the ground was too wet. If someone had walked through here, the rain had washed it clean. I made a full circle of the site and found no one. Still, I didn't go back in. I didn't feel right. I packed up the essentials, knife, flashlight, jacket, my boots, and moved into the trees about 50 yards away. I found a thick patch of pines, crawled beneath one, and waited there, watching the glow of my tent in the dark. An hour passed, then another. At some point, I started to feel ridiculous. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe I dreamt part of it. I was half asleep when I first heard the sounds. The mind plays tricks when you're alone in the dark and tired. But still, I didn't move. I stayed under that tree until just before dawn. That's when I saw movement again. Someone stepped into the edge of the clearing where my tent was. I saw them only in silhouette, backlit by the faint early morning light behind the ridge. They were tall, wearing something dark, maybe a poncho or jacket. They just stood there, looking at the tent. They didn't move for at least 30 seconds. Then they turned and walked away into the trees. Not toward the road, not on any path, just deeper into the forest. I stayed in place another hour before I packed up quietly and left the tent behind. I didn't care about the gear. I moved fast, never turning off my flashlight. The trail was slippery and washed out in places, but I kept going until I reached the road. My truck was still there. No sign of anything wrong. I drove back to Rapid City and checked into a cheap motel. I didn't sleep much that day, or the next. I told myself there was probably a reason. Maybe a hunter, maybe a hiker who got lost. Maybe someone camping illegally and didn't want to be seen. Maybe they thought my tent was empty, or maybe they were just curious. But I couldn't shake the way they just stood there, the way they had touched the tent, the way they walked away without trying to talk or explain. I never reported it. What would I say? That someone touched my tent and stood in the woods? That I saw a shape at dawn? It wasn't illegal to be in that forest. It wasn't even suspicious enough to raise an alarm. But I haven't been camping alone since. Not out in the deep woods. Not even in good weather. Something about that night changed the way I feel out there. I used to think the worst thing that could happen in the wild was a storm or a bear. But now I know the scariest thing out there isn't nature. It's people. I went camping in New South Wales back in 2019, somewhere not far from the Barrington Tops National Park. I was 34 then, working as a freelance outdoor gear tester. Companies would send me tents, sleeping bags, knives, solar chargers, and all kinds of backcountry stuff, and I'd take them out for a spin. Write up honest reviews. Take some decent photos. Nothing glamorous, just a steady gig that paid the bills and kept me outside, which I always preferred. That particular trip was solo. No girlfriend, no friends tagging along, no dog. Just me, a new ultralight tent, and a backpack full of gear I needed to test. I planned to hike 3 days in, spend 2 nights at a remote site next to a stream, then loop back out. I had topo maps, offline GPS on my phone, and a printed copy just in case. I'd done this sort of thing dozens of times. The location wasn't crowded, maybe saw one car parked at the trailhead, but no other people on the way in. I followed a path that used to be an old fire road, mostly overgrown now, with patches of grass and red dirt underfoot. Every so often, kangaroos would dart across or I'd spot wombat scat near a log. Felt normal, peaceful. The forest had that thick Australian eucalyptus smell, sweet, sharp, almost antiseptic. Sunlight filtered through tall gum trees, and the cicadas screamed so loud at times it made the world feel full. I camped near a small creek that fed into the Manning River. Clear water, slow current. No crocs or anything dangerous in this area. First night was uneventful. I made a small fire in a ring of stones, boiled water for some dehydrated beef stew, and crawled into my sleeping bag by 9 p.m. The air got cold after sunset. I remember hearing possums rustling around, but nothing out of the ordinary. The second day, I hiked about 5 kilometers further upriver, just exploring. Took photos of gear set up by the water, tested how fast a solar charger worked under the tree canopy, and noted how the tent held up in light wind. Around midday, I noticed the temperature had dropped a little more than expected. Cloud cover came in fast, which I figured meant a storm might be pushing through. So I packed my stuff and headed back to my original campsite earlier than planned. That's when things started feeling weird. First, I spotted a footprint near the edge of my site. Not mine. I was wearing trail runners with a waffle sole. This was a boot tread. Deep, wide. Could have been someone hiking through, maybe hunting, but it was fresh. The dirt was still moist around the edges, and the imprint hadn't started to dry or fill in with leaf litter. No way it was more than an hour old. I looked around. No one in sight. I called out once. Not yelling, just a kind of low hey. But the woods were quiet. Too quiet, really. Even the cicadas seemed like they'd taken a break. That's when I noticed something else. The stick pile. It was just 20 or 30 meters from my tent, off to the side near the tree line. A big mess of snapped branches, stacked deliberately in a kind of cone. Not a perfect teepee or anything, just a sloppy heap, waist high. I hadn't seen it the day before. No way I would have missed it. It looked almost like someone had started a shelter and gave up halfway. I walked over and poked it with my boot. Dry sticks, some moss on them, but the center was darker, damp, like someone had poured water in the middle recently. Creeped me out, but I tried to shake it off. Could have been a hunter or another camper. Maybe they passed through while I was off hiking and didn't know I was nearby. Still, the combination of the footprint and the pile put me on edge. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed in my tent, zipped up, knife beside me, and just listened. Around 1 a.m., I heard footsteps. Not animal sounds. Human, slow, crunching leaves. Then silence. Then more footsteps from a different direction. The fire was dead by then, and I hadn't lit my headlamp. I didn't want to give away that I was awake, or even there. Really, after maybe 20 minutes, it went quiet again. I didn't unzip the tent. I didn't move. I just laid there in my bag, sweating even though it was freezing outside, and waited for daylight. In the morning, I found 3 new boot prints, all around the site. One was right next to the tree where I'd hung my food bag. Nothing was stolen, but I knew someone had been circling me, watching. I decided to leave early.
Ipakiet fast.
Didn't even boil water. Just filled my bottle at the stream, shoved everything in my pack, and got out. The hike back was mostly downhill. I moved fast but tried not to act panicked. Kept glancing over my shoulder. No one behind me, no one ahead. About halfway back to the car, I saw her. She was maybe 100 meters off trail, standing behind a line of thin trees. At first, I thought it was just a weird-shaped stump, but I kept walking, and the figure didn't move. I stopped, squinted. It was a woman, barefoot, wearing a long, loose shirt, looked like an old button-down men's flannel. Her hair was long and gray, messy, like she hadn't washed it in weeks. Skin looked dirty, sunburned. She just stood there, didn't wave, didn't step forward, didn't do anything. I stood frozen for maybe 15 seconds, and then I kept walking. Didn't run, just walked like nothing had happened. But I knew she was watching me. I didn't look back, not even once. My legs felt hollow, like if I stopped, I might collapse. I got to the car by early afternoon. There was a small dent on the driver's side door that hadn't been there before. Not huge, just a knock like someone had kicked it. Nothing was missing inside, but a piece of string was tied around the passenger side mirror. A thin red string, tight like a bracelet. No note, no reason. I drove straight to the nearest petrol station, 20 minutes away. Called the local police from the payphone out front. Told them what I saw. They sent someone out to check the area. I waited in the car, jittery as hell, sipping a warm Powerade and watching the horizon. 2 hours later, a ranger showed up at the servo. Said they didn't find anyone out there, but they'd keep an eye on it. Probably just a local squatter or someone living rough. Happens more than people think. He told me I was lucky nothing worse happened. I didn't go back there. A few months later, I read a post on a bushwalking forum. Some guy camped in the same area. Said he saw a barefoot woman near his site. She didn't approach, just watched. Then vanished into the trees. No other details. Just enough to confirm what I saw wasn't a one-off. I kept doing gear reviews after that, but I stuck to more trafficked areas. National parks with ranger stations, campsites with check-in logs, places where I could see headlights at night, even faintly, if something went wrong. That woman's face, I never got a good look at it, but her eyes, they felt wrong. Not crazy, not violent, just empty, like there was nothing left in there but the shell. I don't know if she lived out there or wandered through, maybe both, but she was real. And she'd been watching me, more than once. I've never told anyone else about that trip. Not friends, not family, not even in my reviews. Felt too personal, too weird, too close, and I still think about that red string. I took some time off work that summer. It was July 2022, and I had been feeling burned out after months of long shifts and sleepless nights. I was 33, living in a small apartment in Knoxville, Tennessee, and working at a logistics company downtown. My life had started to feel like a loop of emails, traffic, and energy drinks. So when I got the chance to take 10 days off, I packed up my gear and decided to head north for a camping trip. I didn't want a campsite or a tourist spot. I wanted peace, stillness, something that felt completely removed from the life I had been stuck in. I'd been looking at satellite maps and forums, and I found a patch of forest in western Pennsylvania called the Red Pines. Not a real park, just a large tract of state land that was barely touched. A few hunters mentioned it in threads, talking about how there were no roads going deep into it, just old logging paths and dense woods. That's exactly what I wanted. I didn't want to see a single person for a few days, so I packed up my tent, sleeping bag, propane stove, dehydrated meals, water jugs, and a 9mm pistol. I always brought that with me when I went deep into the woods. Not for animals, really, just in case I ever ran into someone with bad intentions. I kept it in a hard case in the bottom of my pack. I left early on a Tuesday morning and drove up through West Virginia and into Pennsylvania. I parked my truck on a dirt pull-off about a mile from the tree line and hiked the rest of the way in. The air was thick with summer heat, but the trees gave some shade. It took me most of the afternoon to get far enough in that I felt isolated. I didn't want to hear any engines, see any headlights, or catch a whiff of campfire smoke from someone else's site. I found a little hollow near a stream where the trees weren't too dense, and I set up camp there. The forest floor was soft with moss and old pine needles. It smelled like sap and earth, and I didn't see any footprints or signs of anyone else passing through. I unpacked my gear, pitched the tent, and boiled some water for one of those freeze-dried meals. I sat on a foam pad with my back against a log and listened to the wind and the insects. Felt perfect. The first 2 days were great. I didn't do much except walk through the woods, collect firewood, and sit by the stream. I read from a paperback I'd brought and kept my phone off except to check GPS once in a while. It barely had service out there anyway. At night I heard owls and coyotes and once what I think was a fox, but it all felt normal. Wild but not threatening. But things changed on the third night. That evening, I'd taken a long walk south along the stream to look for a better place to refill my water jugs. I found a spot where the banks were lower and easier to access, so I filled up and started heading back. It was maybe 6:30 p.m. then, still light out. As I walked, I noticed something in the dirt about 20 feet off the path. Footprints. Not boot prints like mine, bare feet. At first, I thought they might be animal tracks, but when I got closer, I saw toes. 5 of them. Human. They weren't fresh. The edges had dried a bit, but they couldn't have been more than a couple days old. Still, it put me on edge. They weren't small either. They looked about my size, maybe a little bigger, and they were just there, leading toward the tree line and disappearing in the brush. I scanned the trees but didn't see or hear anything. I tried to brush it off. Maybe someone else had come out here, gone swimming or something, though I hadn't seen any signs of another camp. Still, I walked a little faster back to mine and kept my eyes open the whole time. That night, I kept the fire burning longer than usual and made sure the pistol was loaded and close by inside the tent. I didn't hear anything strange. Nothing moved in the dark, but I didn't sleep well. The next morning, I went back to where I'd seen the prints. They were still there. No new ones. No sign of anything out of place. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out here. I decided to hike north instead, just to explore and distract myself. I brought my day pack, the pistol, and some food and water. I walked a few miles until I reached a patch of woods that felt different, older somehow. The trees were thick, and the sunlight barely reached the forest floor. That's where I found it. It looked like an old hunting shelter at first. Just a tarp strung up between two trees, half collapsed and covered in needles and leaves. But when I got closer, I saw bones. Animal bones, at least I think they were, small, some clean, some still with fur or bits of flesh. They were scattered around the tarp. I didn't touch anything, just stood there, trying to piece it together. There was an old backpack too, ripped open, moldy, and something that looked like a handmade spear, just a sharpened stick with duct tape wrapped around the base. I didn't like any of it. It looked like someone had been living out here, but not in any normal way. Not camping, hiding. I backed away and didn't stay long. I didn't want to be there if whoever had made that shelter came back. I hiked back fast, kept checking behind me. When I got back to my camp, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. My tarp had been moved, just one corner, pulled loose like someone had stepped on the edge or yanked it. Could have been an animal, sure, but nothing had chewed on it or torn it, just displaced slightly like someone had been looking underneath. I kept the pistol on me that whole night. I didn't light a fire. I didn't want to draw attention. I just lay there in the tent listening. Every crack of a branch made my pulse jump. Around 3 a.m., I heard something move. Slow, deliberate steps on the pine needles outside the tent. Not a deer, not a raccoon. Too heavy and too slow, like someone trying not to make noise. I held my breath. The steps circled once, then stopped. I could hear breathing very faint, then nothing. I waited. 10 minutes, 20. Eventually, I heard retreating steps, fainter, slower. I stayed still for another hour. Didn't sleep at all. The first light, I got up and packed. I didn't eat or boil water. I just jammed everything into my bag, slung it on my back, and got out of there. I didn't take the old trail. I cut straight through the woods using GPS. I didn't want to pass near that old shelter. My goal was to hit the tree line by noon. I moved fast but carefully. After a few hours, I stopped to catch my breath and noticed something that froze me. On a tree about 20 feet behind me, there was a mark, carved into the bark, a symbol, 2 X's overlapping, like a jagged star. I hadn't passed it before, which meant someone else had carved it, and recently. I didn't waste another second. I hiked until my legs burned and my mouth was dry. I saw the road around 2 p.m., and my truck was still there, undisturbed. I threw my pack into the bed, climbed in, and locked the doors before I even started the engine. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. I didn't report anything. I didn't know what to report. No crime, no body. Just footprints, bones, and the constant feeling that someone was watching me. I didn't want to answer questions or have to go back. I haven't camped since then. That trip taught me something I didn't expect. Nature isn't always peaceful. Sometimes it's just a place to disappear. A place where the wrong person can watch you for days without you ever knowing. Where footsteps in the dark mean someone is too close. I still think about that shelter, the bones, the circle of breathing just outside my tent. And every now and then, when I'm walking to my truck after work or taking out the trash at night, I swear I catch a hint of pine on the wind and feel like someone is watching me again. But I don't go back. I'll never go back.